Alaska holds secrets that would freeze your blood even in summer. Tonight, we're venturing into the last American frontier where the cold isn't the only thing that kills. Where 663,300 square miles of wilderness have swallowed people whole and spit back only nightmares. I'm bringing you 11 documented cases that prove sometimes truth is far more terrifying than fiction. From gold rush-era massacres that still echo through modern Alaska, to missing persons cases that defy every logical explanation, to survival stories so brutal they'll make you question what humans are truly capable of when pushed beyond their breaking point. If you're ready to discover why experienced hunters refuse to enter certain valleys, why bush pilots won't fly over specific coordinates, and why some Alaskan towns have secrets their residents will never speak about, then hit that subscribe button right now, because Verified Fears is about to take you on a journey through Alaska's darkest documented horrors. But I'm warning you. Once you learn what really lurks in America's last wilderness, you'll never look at those pristine travel photos the same way again. Let's begin with a story that starts with a single cabin, perfect silence, and a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. Let's move to our first story. The first snowfall of October in 1987 came early to the Denali wilderness, blanketing the isolated trapline cabin where John had chosen to spend his winter. What started as 6 months of solitude would become one of Alaska's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. A case that would leave investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about human nature and survival. John wasn't your typical city dweller seeking adventure in the Alaskan bush. The 42-year-old former Marine had spent nearly 2 decades working the North Slope oil fields, accumulating enough money and wilderness knowledge to pursue his dream of living completely off-grid. In late September 1987, he loaded his pickup truck with enough supplies for 6 months. Canned goods, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, a high-powered radio capable of reaching Fairbanks, nearly 200 miles away. His plan was methodical and reasonable. Spend the winter trapping and hunting, checking in with his brother Danny every Sunday at exactly 8 p.m. via radio, and emerge in spring with enough furs to fund another year of freedom. The cabin John had selected sat 37 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a treacherous trail that became impassable once the deep snows arrived. Built in the 1940s by a long-dead prospector, the structure was solid. Thick log walls chinked with moss and mud, a stone fireplace that could heat the single room efficiently, and small windows that offered commanding views of the surrounding wilderness. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear from civilization. But as John would soon discover, some things in Alaska don't want to stay hidden. For the first 3 weeks, John's radio check-ins with Danny were punctual and reassuring. He reported excellent weather, successful hunting. He had already taken a small caribou and several ptarmigan, and was settling into the rhythm of wilderness life. His voice carried the contentment of a man finally living his dream. Danny later told investigators that his brother sounded more at peace than he had in years, describing the profound silence of the wilderness, the northern lights dancing across the sky, and the simple satisfaction of chopping wood and maintaining his trap lines. The first sign something was wrong came during John's radio call on November 15th, exactly 5 weeks into his winter sojourn. When Danny answered at their usual time, John's voice was different, strained, almost whispering. He reported that something had been circling his cabin for 3 nights straight, staying just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. At first, Danny assumed it was a bear reluctant to enter hibernation, or perhaps a pack of wolves. John was an experienced outdoorsman who understood wildlife behavior, so Danny wasn't immediately concerned. But John's description was unsettling. He claimed whatever was out there moved with intelligence, testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. The next Sunday, November 22nd, John's radio call was even more disturbing. His voice had taken on a paranoid edge as he described finding tracks in the snow around his cabin. Tracks that made no sense. They were too large to be human, but they showed deliberate pattern and purpose that no animal would display. More troubling, someone or something had been stacking rocks in precise cairns around his property line, always just at the edge of the forest, where the shadows were deepest. John had destroyed these stone markers repeatedly, but they reappeared overnight, always in slightly different configurations, as if his unseen visitor was communicating through some ancient language of stone and placement. During that same call, John mentioned finding his trap lines disturbed in ways that defied explanation. The traps hadn't been sprung or stolen. Instead, they'd been carefully disassembled and reconstructed in impossible positions, hanging from tree branches 20 feet off the ground or buried completely under snow and marked with more of those mysterious rock cairns. Whatever was toying with him understood technology well enough to manipulate his equipment, but displayed behavior patterns unlike anything in his decades of wilderness experience. By November 29th, John's mental state had deteriorated significantly. His radio transmission that night lasted only 3 minutes, during which he described being watched constantly by something that stayed hidden during daylight but became bold after sunset. He'd reinforced his cabin door with additional lumber and blocked the windows, living essentially in darkness to avoid giving his stalker any glimpse inside. Most disturbing of all, John reported hearing sounds that made his blood freeze. A rhythmic tapping on his walls that followed complex patterns, lasting for hours each night, always coming from different sides of the cabin, as if multiple entities were coordinating their psychological assault. Danny tried to convince John to abandon the cabin and hike out to safety, but John refused to leave his supplies and equipment behind. More troubling, he seemed convinced that whatever was hunting him would follow him back to civilization, putting innocent people at risk. Danny offered to arrange a bush pilot extraction, but John dismissed this option as well, claiming that the thing stalking him was too intelligent to be escaped so easily. His paranoia had reached the point where he trusted no one's judgment but his own, isolating himself even from the brother who was trying to save his life. December 6th brought John's final radio transmission, a call that would haunt Danny for the rest of his life. John's voice was barely recognizable, a hoarse whisper filled with terror and exhaustion. He reported that his stalker had finally revealed itself the previous night, though his description made little sense to Danny. According to John, the creature was simultaneously familiar and impossible, displaying characteristics that suggested it was something that had once been human, but had been changed by the wilderness into something else entirely. John claimed it had stood outside his window for hours, not quite tall enough to look inside, but casting a shadow that seemed to move independently of its body. Most chilling of all, John insisted that the creature had begun speaking to him in his own voice, repeating conversations he'd had with Danny during previous radio calls, reciting personal memories that no outsider could possibly know. The psychological warfare had evolved into something far more insidious than simple stalking. His tormentor was somehow stealing pieces of his identity, learning to become him in ways that violated everything John understood about reality. The radio call ended abruptly when John claimed to hear his own voice calling to him from outside the cabin, begging to be let in from the cold. Danny listened in horror as John whispered a hurried goodbye, promising to contact him the following Sunday if he survived whatever was about to happen. The transmission cut to static, and despite Danny's desperate attempts to re-establish contact, John's radio remained silent. When John failed to make his scheduled call on December 13th, Danny immediately contacted Alaska state troopers. The weather conditions made immediate rescue impossible, but on December 18th, a helicopter crew managed to reach John's location during a brief window of clear skies. What they found defied explanation and would become one of the most documented yet inexplicable discoveries in Alaska law enforcement history. John's cabin stood undamaged and properly maintained, with smoke still rising from the chimney and signs of recent habitation throughout the interior. His supplies were neatly organized, his radio was in perfect working condition, and his personal belongings remained untouched. Most puzzling of all, there was evidence that someone had been living in the cabin recently. Fresh food prepared but not consumed, wet clothes hanging near the fire, and John's journal filled with entries dating up to the day before the rescue team's arrival. But John himself had vanished completely, leaving behind a mystery that investigators are still trying to solve nearly 4 decades later. The rescue team found no tracks leading away from the cabin, no signs of struggle, and no indication that John had packed any supplies for a journey. His snowshoes hung on their usual peg, his winter coat remained in the cabin, and his boots sat by the door as if he'd simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. The journal entries provided some insight into John's final weeks, but raised more questions than they answered. His handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, and the content grew more paranoid and disjointed. But the final entry, dated December 17th, 1 day before the rescue, was written in perfectly normal handwriting and described a peaceful morning routine, with no mention of being stalked or terrorized. It was as if the previous weeks of horror had been erased from John's mind, or as if someone else had been writing in his journal. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the rock cairns the rescue team found scattered throughout the forest around John's cabin. There were dozens of them, arranged in complex geometric patterns that seemed to radiate outward from the cabin in all directions. Each cairn was constructed with mathematical precision, using stones that had been carefully selected and balanced. The formations suggested intelligence and purpose, but followed no known cultural or archaeological precedents. The Alaska state troopers conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing Danny multiple times and analyzing every piece of evidence from the cabin. They brought in tracking experts, wildlife specialists, and even anthropologists to examine the stone formations. Every expert reached the same conclusion. The evidence suggested John had been alone in the wilderness, living normally until the day he disappeared, with no signs of the psychological breakdown his radio calls had described. To this day, John's fate remains unknown. Search teams have combed thousands of square miles of wilderness around his cabin, following up on dozens of reported sightings and false leads. The cabin itself has been visited by numerous investigators, thrill seekers, and paranormal researchers, many of whom report feeling watched while in the area, though none have encountered anything as dramatic as John's experience. Danny continues to believe his brother encountered something in those woods that defied conventional explanation, something that drove him to the edge of sanity before making him disappear entirely. The radio transmissions were recorded on Danny's equipment, providing audio evidence of John's deteriorating mental state. But investigators maintain that isolation and paranoia could easily account for his reported experiences. The truth about what happened to John in that remote Alaskan cabin remains one of the wilderness's most guarded secrets. A reminder that some mysteries are too dark and complex for human understanding. In a land where people regularly vanish without a trace, John's case stands apart for its combination of detailed documentation and complete lack of resolution. A perfect example of how Alaska's wilderness can swallow people not just physically, but in ways that challenge everything we think we know about reality itself. Our second story takes place on Alaska's most dangerous stretch of highway, where winter storms can turn a routine drive into a deadly trap that defies everything you thought you knew about survival. In February 1994, three friends heading to Fairbanks for a weekend of ice fishing encountered something in a whiteout blizzard that would challenge their sanity and leave only one of them alive to tell their impossible story. Stephen, Luke, and Brett had made this drive dozens of times during Alaska's brutal winters, hauling their ice fishing gear up the park's highway toward their favorite spot near Nenana. The three Anchorage construction workers were experienced Alaskans who understood winter driving. They carried emergency supplies, knew how to read weather conditions, and never traveled the backcountry alone. But on that February night, all their preparation would prove worthless against something that hunting guides and truckers still refused to discuss openly. The weather forecast had called for light snow. But as they passed the Wasilla turnoff around 8 p.m., visibility began deteriorating rapidly. What started as scattered flakes became a wall of white that swallowed their headlight beams within 20 feet of their truck. Stephen, who was driving his modified Ford pickup, slowed to 15 miles per hour and activated his hazard lights, following the reflective road markers that were becoming increasingly difficult to spot through the swirling snow. Luke, riding shotgun, was monitoring the CB radio for weather updates and road conditions when they heard the first transmission that should have warned them to turn back. A trucker's voice, distorted by static, was reporting vehicles stopped along the highway ahead, describing what sounded like a multi-car pileup near mile marker 187. But when Stephen asked for clarification, the radio fell silent. They tried multiple channels, reaching out to other travelers, but received no response, unusual for a highway where truckers and locals maintained constant chatter about road conditions. As they crept forward through the blizzard, the temperature gauge on Stephen's truck began climbing toward the red zone, forcing them to stop and check the engine. Brett volunteered to walk ahead and assess road conditions, while Stephen popped the hood to investigate the overheating. What Brett discovered when he returned 15 minutes later would be the first indication that they'd encountered something far more dangerous than severe weather. According to Brett's breathless report, he'd walked nearly a quarter-mile ahead without finding any sign of the reported accident. No flashing lights, no stopped vehicles, no debris in the road. More disturbing, he'd encountered three other vehicles that appeared to be abandoned, their engines still running, but their interiors completely empty. The cars were coated with ice and snow as if they'd been sitting there for hours, yet their exhaust pipes were still producing steam, and their headlights remained on. Most puzzling of all, there were no footprints leading away from any of the vehicles, despite the fresh snow that should have preserved any tracks. Stephen dismissed Brett's report as confusion caused by the blinding snow. But when they resumed driving, they began seeing the abandoned vehicles for themselves. Car after car sat empty along both sides of the highway, creating an eerie corridor of ghost cars stretching into the white void ahead. Each vehicle appeared to have been recently occupied, engines warm, radios playing, personal belongings scattered on seats. Yet not a single person could be found anywhere near them. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Families had apparently vanished mid-journey, leaving behind running cars with doors unlocked and keys in the ignition. A Honda Civic with Colorado plates contained a woman's purse, children's toys, and a thermos of coffee that was still warm to the touch. A pickup truck from Fairbanks had a CB radio crackling with unanswered calls, its emergency flashers blinking rhythmically through the storm. Most disturbing was a state trooper's patrol car, empty but with its emergency lights active and the driver's door hanging open, as if the officer had stepped out to investigate something and simply disappeared. As Stephen navigated between the abandoned vehicles, Luke noticed that their truck's radio was picking up strange transmissions, not the normal chatter of truckers and travelers, but voices that seemed to be calling out names, pleading for help, describing locations that didn't match any landmarks on the park's highway. The voices were distorted by static, but Luke could swear some of them sounded like the people they'd passed in the abandoned cars, as if the missing drivers and passengers were somehow broadcasting from wherever they'd been taken. Brett, growing increasingly agitated in the back seat, insisted they turn around immediately and flee back toward Anchorage. But when Stephen attempted to execute a U-turn, they discovered that the highway behind them had changed. The abandoned cars they'd passed minutes earlier were no longer there, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the white void without any familiar landmarks or mile markers. More troubling still, their truck's compass was spinning wildly, unable to maintain a consistent direction despite their straight-line travel. The realization that they were trapped in something beyond a normal blizzard hit them when Luke spotted movement in the storm. Not the chaotic swirling of wind-driven snow, but deliberate shapes that seemed to be pacing their vehicle just beyond the reach of their headlights. These shadows maintained perfect formation, matching their speed and direction changes with an intelligence that no natural phenomenon could possess. When Stephen slowed down, the shapes slowed with them. When he accelerated, they kept perfect pace, always remaining just at the edge of visibility. The psychological pressure of being stalked by invisible entities began taking its toll on the three friends. Brett became convinced that whatever was hunting them was using the abandoned cars as bait, luring travelers into the storm before making them disappear. Luke argued they should stop and try to make contact, believing the shadows might be other travelers seeking help. Stephen remained focused on driving, but even his steady nerves were cracking under the stress of navigating through an increasingly surreal landscape where the laws of physics seemed suspended. Their situation deteriorated further when they realized their fuel gauge was dropping far faster than it should, despite their slow speed and steady pace. The truck's heating system began failing, allowing the deadly cold to seep into the cab, while strange sounds echoed from outside. Not the howl of wind, but rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from all around them simultaneously. The shadows in the storm grew bolder, occasionally darting close enough to the truck that they could glimpse partial shapes, forms that looked human but moved with impossible fluidity through the driving snow. As their fuel reached critical levels and the cold became unbearable, the three friends faced an impossible choice: remain in their dying truck and freeze to death, or venture outside into the storm where the shadows were waiting. Brett, who had become increasingly irrational, suddenly opened his door and stepped into the blizzard before Stephen or Luke could stop him. His figure was immediately swallowed by the white wall of snow, and despite their desperate shouts, he never responded or returned. Stephen and Luke sat in stunned silence for several minutes, listening to the strange tapping sounds that seemed to be circling their truck. When Luke finally volunteered to search for Brett, Stephen grabbed his arm and pointed ahead through the windshield. Through the swirling snow, they could see Brett standing motionless about 50 feet away, his back turned toward them. But something was wrong with his posture. He stood too still, too perfectly upright in the howling wind. And when Luke called his name, Brett began walking away from them with mechanical, unnatural movements. The sight of their friend's strange behavior broke Luke's resolve entirely. Against Stephen's protests, he opened the passenger door and ran into the storm, calling Brett's name as he disappeared into the white void. Stephen found himself completely alone, surrounded by an impossible blizzard that defied all his understanding of weather patterns and natural phenomena. The shadows in the storm had grown more aggressive, pressing close to his windows and seeming to test his resolve. while the strange tapping sounds intensified until they sounded like hundreds of fingers drumming against his truck's exterior. With his fuel nearly exhausted and hypothermia setting in, Stephen made the decision that would save his life. Instead of following his friends into the storm, he turned off his engine, wrapped himself in every piece of clothing and emergency blanket he could find, and settled in to wait. He reasoned that if he could survive until dawn, the storm might break and reveal his true location. It was a desperate gamble, but one that proved correct when he awakened 12 hours later to brilliant sunshine and the sound of approaching vehicles. Stephen's rescue came courtesy of a state highway maintenance crew who found his truck parked normally alongside the park's highway, exactly where he remembered stopping the night before. But according to the crew chief's report, there had been no major storm in the area, only light snow that had ended around midnight. More puzzling, Stephen's truck contained nearly a full tank of gas, contradicting his memory of running dangerously low on fuel during the night. The search for Luke and Brett consumed hundreds of man-hours and involved multiple agencies. But no trace of either man was ever found. Searchers combed every mile of highway between Anchorage and Fairbanks, checked every abandoned building and side road, and interviewed every resident of the remote communities along the route. The abandoned cars Stephen described were never located, despite his detailed descriptions of their positions and license plates. Most troubling of all, when investigators checked the registration of the Colorado Honda Civic Stephen had examined, they discovered it belonged to a family that had disappeared on the park's highway 3 years earlier under similarly mysterious circumstances. Stephen's account was corroborated by CB radio recordings that captured portions of the strange transmissions Luke had reported. But the voices on the recordings were too distorted by static to identify. Weather Service records confirmed that atmospheric conditions that night were unusual. Temperature inversions and electromagnetic anomalies that could theoretically cause radio interference and compass malfunctions. But nothing that would explain the disappearance of 2 grown men. To this day, Stephen refuses to drive the park's highway during winter storms, and he's become something of an advocate for travelers who report strange experiences on Alaska's remote roads. He maintains that something in that blizzard was systematically collecting people, using the abandoned cars and the voices on the radio to lure travelers into stopping. His theory, supported by several other witnesses over the years, is that certain weather conditions create opportunities for something predatory to hunt along Alaska's highways, taking people who will never be missed until it's too late to mount an effective search. The fate of Luke and Brett remains unknown, but Stephen occasionally receives CB radio transmissions late at night that feature voices remarkably similar to his missing friends. These broadcasts always come during severe weather events, and they're always calling for help from locations that don't exist on any map. Whether these transmissions represent his friends' attempt to communicate from wherever they were taken, or something more sinister using their voices as bait for new victims, remains one of Alaska's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The park's highway continues to claim travelers during severe weather events, with dozens of people vanishing without a trace over the decades since Stephen's encounter. While officials attribute these disappearances to the harsh conditions and vast wilderness areas where bodies might never be recovered, those who know Stephen's story wonder if something far more dangerous than weather is stalking Alaska's highways, waiting for the perfect storm to add new victims to its growing collection. Our third story leads us deep into the heart of the Alaska Triangle, where science meets the supernatural and rational minds are forced to confront the impossible. In July 1996, a 5-person geological survey team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks ventured into the remote wilderness near Mount McKinley to conduct routine mineral assessments that would become anything but routine. What started as a standard research expedition would evolve into one of Alaska's most thoroughly documented, yet completely inexplicable disappearances, challenging everything we think we know about the laws of physics and human behavior. The team consisted of Leah, a respected geologist with 15 years of Arctic field experience, her graduate students Philip and Andrew, equipment specialist Kevin Murphy, and local guide Thomas Nakamura, an Athabaskan native who had spent his entire life navigating Alaska's wilderness. Their mission was straightforward: collect rock and soil samples from a previously unmapped valley system, establish baseline mineral content readings, and return to Fairbanks within 10 days with enough data to support a comprehensive geological survey of the region. The expedition was meticulously planned and equipped with the latest technology available in 1996. Each team member carried GPS units, emergency beacons, satellite phones, and enough supplies for 2 weeks in the wilderness. Leah had obtained all necessary permits, filed detailed itineraries with Park Service officials, and established daily check-in protocols with the university's emergency coordinator. Thomas had scouted the target area extensively, identifying safe camping locations and viable evacuation routes in case of medical emergencies or severe weather. Their first 3 days proceeded exactly according to plan. The team established base camp at coordinates that Thomas had selected for its defensible position and proximity to fresh water. Then began systematic collection of geological samples from the surrounding valley floor. Leah's daily radio transmissions to Fairbanks were professional and optimistic. The mineral content readings were exceeding expectations, weather conditions remained favorable, and team morale was excellent despite the physical demands of working in remote terrain. The first indication that something was wrong came during Leah's scheduled transmission on July 12th, their 4th day in the field. Her voice carried an undertone of confusion as she reported discovering geological formations that contradicted everything their preliminary surveys had suggested. According to Leah's increasingly excited description, they had found mineral deposits and rock formations that shouldn't exist in this region. Rare earth elements that typically required millions of years of specific geological processes, arranged in patterns that seemed almost artificially created. More troubling was Leah's report that their GPS units had begun malfunctioning simultaneously, all showing different coordinates for the same location and displaying impossible readings that placed their position hundreds of miles from their actual site. Thomas, despite his decades of wilderness experience, admitted to being confused about their exact location, claiming that familiar landmarks had somehow shifted overnight. The team's compass readings were equally unreliable, spinning wildly or pointing in directions that contradicted their known position relative to Mount McKinley. Philip, who was documenting their discoveries through detailed photographs and sketches, reported during that same transmission that his camera equipment was behaving strangely. Digital photos were showing landscapes that didn't match what he was actually photographing, displaying additional rock formations, vegetation, and even structures that weren't visible to the naked eye. When he attempted to photograph these anomalous features directly, his camera would malfunction or produce completely black images, despite perfect lighting conditions. Andrew, whose specialty was soil composition analysis, discovered samples that defied scientific explanation. Routine tests revealed mineral combinations that violated known geological principles, elements that couldn't coexist under natural conditions, isotope ratios that suggested the rocks were simultaneously ancient and newly formed, and crystalline structures that seemed to change their properties depending on the time of day they were examined. His field notes, later recovered by search teams, described a growing conviction that they had discovered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about geology and physics. The team's final coherent transmission came on July 15th, 8 days into their expedition. Leah's voice was strained and barely controlled as she reported that Thomas had disappeared during the night without explanation. His sleeping bag remained in perfect condition inside the tent he shared with Kevin. His personal belongings were untouched, and there were no tracks leading away from their campsite, despite the soft soil that should have preserved any footprints. Most disturbing, Thomas had apparently vanished while Kevin was sleeping just 3 feet away. And Kevin insisted he had heard no sounds or disturbances throughout the night. During that same transmission, Leah described increasingly bizarre environmental conditions in their valley. The weather patterns were behaving independently of the surrounding region. Snow falling in their immediate area while sunshine was visible just beyond the valley walls. Temperature fluctuations that didn't correspond to normal atmospheric conditions, and wind patterns that seemed to move in geometric formations rather than natural air currents. Philip reported that his photographs were now showing completely different landscapes from one day to the next, as if the valley itself was reshaping its appearance overnight. Andrew's soil samples had begun, exhibiting properties that violated basic chemistry. Rocks that had tested as granite were now showing characteristics of volcanic glass. Mineral deposits were changing color and composition during analysis. And his electronic equipment was registering energy emissions from the samples that shouldn't be possible from inert geological specimens. His final notes described a growing fear that they had stumbled into an area where natural laws operated differently, creating conditions that human science wasn't equipped to understand or explain. The search and rescue operation launched when the team missed their July 18th check-in was the most comprehensive in Alaska's history at that time. Multiple helicopter crews, ground teams, and search dogs combed every square mile of their planned research area, following GPS coordinates from their filed itinerary and expanding the search radius daily. The operation continued for 3 weeks without finding any trace of the missing team members, their equipment, or their base camp. What the searchers did discover was equally puzzling. The valley system that Leah's team had been investigating didn't match any topographical maps or satellite imagery. The terrain features, elevation readings, and geographical landmarks described in the team's transmissions couldn't be located despite precise coordinate references. Multiple survey teams verified that the area contained standard geological formations consistent with the rest of the region, with no evidence of the rare mineral deposits or unusual rock formations that had excited Leah so much. The breakthrough in the case came accidentally 6 months later, when a commercial pilot flying a routine cargo run reported seeing campfire smoke rising from a valley that matched the team's last known coordinates. A helicopter crew dispatched to investigate found the team's base camp exactly as Leah had described it in her transmissions, complete with tents, scientific equipment, food supplies, and personal belongings, all in perfect condition despite having been exposed to Alaska's harsh weather for over 6 months. But the team members themselves were nowhere to be found, and the campsite raised more questions than it answered. The equipment showed no signs of weather damage or animal interference, despite being unsecured in the wilderness for half a year. Food supplies remained fresh and unspoiled. Scientific instruments were still operational with batteries at full charge, and personal items were arranged as if the team had simply stepped away temporarily and planned to return within minutes. Most puzzling were the research materials left behind. Philip's cameras contained thousands of photographs showing landscapes and formations that didn't correspond to any known location in Alaska. The images depicted geological features that violated known physics, rock formations that appeared to be growing like plants, mineral deposits that seemed to pulse with internal light, and terrain that shifted between different configurations within the same photograph. Some images showed what appeared to be structures or buildings that resembled no known architecture, integrated seamlessly into the natural landscape. Andrew's soil samples had undergone further transformation during the months they sat unattended. Laboratory analysis revealed that the specimens contained elements not found on Earth's periodic table, arranged in molecular structures that existing scientific knowledge couldn't explain. More disturbing, the samples continued to exhibit unusual properties, changing temperature independently of their environment, producing electromagnetic fields that interfered with electronic equipment and demonstrating what could only be described as responsive behavior to human presence. Leah's research notes provided the most comprehensive documentation of their discoveries, but also the most troubling insights into their final days. Her handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, describing a growing conviction that their valley existed in some kind of dimensional overlap, where different versions of reality intersected. She theorized that the geological anomalies they'd discovered were actually glimpses into alternate versions of Alaska, where different evolutionary and geological processes had shaped the landscape. The final entry in Leah's journal, dated the day after their last radio transmission, described the team's decision to investigate a structure that had appeared overnight at the center of their research area. According to her description, this building seemed to shift between different architectural styles and materials, sometimes appearing as ancient stone construction, other times resembling modern scientific facilities. The team had decided to enter the structure together, believing it might hold answers to the phenomena they'd been documenting. That journal entry ended mid-sentence, and no further documentation of the team's activities has ever been found. The search for the missing researchers continued sporadically for several years, but no additional evidence was ever discovered. The campsite itself disappeared again within weeks of its discovery, with subsequent aerial surveys showing only normal terrain where the base camp had been located. The fate of Leah, Philip, Andrew, Kevin, and Thomas remains one of Alaska's most thoroughly documented, yet completely unsolved mysteries. The scientific evidence they left behind continues to challenge researchers who study their case, providing physical proof of phenomena that mainstream science insists should be impossible. Their disappearance serves as a reminder that Alaska's wilderness harbors secrets that may be beyond human understanding, and that some research expeditions discover more than they were prepared to handle. Today, the area where the team vanished is avoided by local guides and experienced wilderness travelers who report unusual compass behavior, equipment malfunctions, and a persistent feeling of being observed when passing through the region. Whether the team found their way into some parallel version of Alaska or encountered something far more dangerous than they anticipated, their story stands as a warning that not all of nature's mysteries are meant to be solved by human curiosity. Our fourth story brings us face to face with pure human evil, where the vast Alaskan wilderness became a hunting ground for one of America's most methodical and terrifying killers. Between 1971 and 1983, Robert Hansen transformed from a mild-mannered small-town baker into a predator who used Alaska's remote wilderness as his personal killing field, proving that sometimes the most dangerous monsters hide behind the most ordinary facades. Robert Hansen appeared to be the perfect neighbor and businessman in Anchorage during the 1970s and early 1980s. He owned a successful bakery just a short distance from Merrill Field, where he kept his prized Piper Super Cub aircraft. Hansen was married with 2 children, active in his local church, and known throughout the community as a skilled hunter and outdoorsman who could navigate Alaska's most treacherous terrain with ease. His bakery was popular with locals, and Hansen himself seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. A hard-working immigrant from Iowa who had built a successful life in America's last frontier. But beneath Hansen's carefully constructed facade lay a calculating predator who had been planning the perfect hunting ground for years. His choice of Alaska wasn't accidental. He understood that the state's vast wilderness areas, sparse law enforcement coverage, and transient population would provide him with unprecedented opportunities to commit crimes without detection. Hansen had studied Alaska's geography obsessively, identifying remote locations that could only be accessed by aircraft. Areas so isolated that victims would never be found, and their disappearances might never trigger intensive investigations. Hansen's methodology was as methodical as it was horrifying. He specifically targeted women from vulnerable populations, individuals struggling with addiction, homelessness, or those working in dangerous occupations whose society often overlooked. Hansen understood that these victims often had complicated relationships with law enforcement, making them less likely to be believed if they managed to escape his initial attempts, and their disappearances might not trigger immediate, intensive investigations. He was coldly calculating in his victim selection, choosing women whose lifestyles made them vulnerable, and whose deaths might be attributed to the dangers of street life rather than systematic predation. The process Hansen used to hunt his victims followed a terrifyingly consistent pattern that demonstrated both his intelligence and complete lack of human empathy. He would approach potential victims in Anchorage, often posing as a customer, and invite them to accompany him for what he claimed would be lucrative work or a simple transaction. Hansen was skilled at appearing harmless and trustworthy. His mild appearance, his successful business, and his reputation in the community all worked to disarm women who might otherwise be suspicious of strangers. Once Hansen had gained a victim's trust and lured her away from populated areas, he would drive to his home or another private location where he would begin the psychological manipulation that was central to his killing ritual. Hansen would inform his victims that they were going to be taken to remote wilderness areas, explaining in methodical detail exactly what he planned to do to them. He derived pleasure from watching their terror as they realized the hopelessness of their situation and understood that their survival was unlikely. This psychological manipulation was as important to Hansen as the physical crimes that would follow. Hansen would then force his victims into his aircraft and fly them to remote locations throughout south-central Alaska, areas he had carefully scouted and selected for their isolation and difficulty of access. These locations were typically accessible only by small aircraft, ensuring that even if his victims somehow managed to escape his immediate control, they would face impossible odds trying to survive in Alaska's harsh wilderness without supplies, proper clothing, or knowledge of their location. Hansen had effectively created a killing ground where nature itself became his accomplice. The hunting phase of Hansen's ritual was where his true sadism emerged most clearly. He would release his victims into the wilderness, sometimes providing them with minimal head starts, and then track them using his extensive knowledge of outdoor survival and hunting techniques. Hansen was an expert marksman, an experienced tracker who understood animal behavior, skills that translated horrifyingly well to hunting human beings who were already traumatized, disoriented, and completely unprepared for survival in Alaska's backcountry. Hansen's crimes continued for over a decade without detection, partly because of his careful victim selection and remote killing locations, but also because of his ability to maintain his facade as a respectable businessman and community member. He continued operating his bakery, participating in community events, and maintaining normal family relationships, even while systematically taking lives throughout the Anchorage area. This dual existence demonstrated the calculated nature of his pathology. He was capable of switching between his roles as predator and community member without apparent difficulty. The investigation that eventually exposed Hansen's crimes began when one of his intended victims managed to escape and report her ordeal to police. In June 1983, a 17-year-old woman approached an Alaska state trooper and described being kidnapped, threatened with death by a man who owned a bakery near Merrill Field. Her detailed description of Hansen's aircraft, his home, and his threats provided investigators with their first concrete lead in what they were beginning to realize might be a series of connected crimes. The investigation revealed the full scope of Hansen's crimes, Through a combination of physical evidence, victim testimony, and Hansen's own detailed confessions once he realized that capture was inevitable. When investigators searched Hansen's home, they discovered detailed maps of Alaska marking remote locations and jewelry belonging to missing women. More damning still, they found Hansen's aviation charts marked with symbols indicating the locations where he had taken his victims, a macabre record-keeping system that demonstrated the systematic nature of his crimes. Under interrogation, Hansen eventually confessed to 17 murders, though investigators believe the actual number of his victims may have been significantly higher. Hansen provided detailed descriptions of his crimes, leading investigators to multiple grave sites throughout south-central Alaska and helping them identify victims who had been missing for years. His methodical record-keeping and precise memory of his crimes revealed the calculating intelligence he had applied to developing and perfecting his killing methodology over more than a decade. The physical evidence recovered from Hansen's victims and crime scenes painted a horrifying picture of systematic torture and murder. The remote locations where bodies were found confirmed that victims had been transported by aircraft to areas where they had no possibility of escape or rescue, demonstrating the premeditated nature of every aspect of Hansen's crimes. The evidence showed that Hansen had created a systematic method for isolating and eliminating his victims, while minimizing his risk of detection. Hansen's case sent shockwaves through Alaska's law enforcement community and fundamentally changed how missing person cases involving vulnerable women were investigated. The realization that a seemingly respectable businessman had been systematically hunting human beings in Alaska's wilderness for over a decade highlighted the unique challenges of policing such a vast and remote territory. Hansen had successfully exploited the very characteristics that made Alaska appealing to many residents: its wilderness, isolation, and independence from government oversight, to create the perfect environment for serial murder. The psychological profile that emerged from Hansen's case study revealed a perpetrator who combined intelligence, outdoor skills, and complete lack of empathy into a uniquely dangerous predator. Hansen's ability to maintain his facade as a productive community member while systematically taking lives demonstrated the sophisticated nature of his pathology. He had carefully studied his environment and potential victims, developing a methodology that minimized his risk of detection while maximizing his opportunity to inflict harm. Hansen's trial and conviction brought some measure of justice for his victims and their families, but also raised disturbing questions about how many other predators might be operating in Alaska's remote areas without detection. His case highlighted the vulnerability of Alaska's most marginalized residents and the need for law enforcement strategies specifically adapted to the state's unique geography and demographics. Hansen had proven that Alaska's wilderness, which many residents viewed as a source of freedom and natural beauty, could also provide perfect cover for unthinkable crimes. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another victim. He died in 2014 at age 75, taking whatever additional secrets about his crimes with him to the grave. But his case continues to influence law enforcement practices in Alaska and serves as a reminder that predators can successfully operate for extended periods in environments where traditional policing methods are inadequate. The legacy of Robert Hansen's crimes extends far beyond the specific murders he committed. His case exposed systemic issues in how law enforcement agencies handle cases involving marginalized victims, highlighted the unique challenges of policing Alaska's remote areas, and demonstrated how geographic isolation can be exploited by sophisticated predators. Hansen proved that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearances, and that Alaska's wilderness, for all its beauty and freedom, can also conceal the darkest aspects of human nature. Today, Hansen's name remains synonymous with Alaska's most notorious criminal cases, serving as a reminder that even in America's most remote frontier, predators can find ways to systematically hunt and kill with devastating efficiency. His story stands as testament to the importance of never dismissing the disappearances of society's most vulnerable members, and the need for law enforcement strategies specifically designed to address the unique challenges of protecting people in Alaska's vast and unforgiving wilderness. Our fifth story takes us into the realm where ancient native legends collide with modern horror, where the dancing northern lights become harbingers of something far more terrifying than natural beauty. In October 1978, a respected bush pilot named David encountered something in the remote Alaskan wilderness that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world, forcing him to confront a supernatural force that indigenous peoples had whispered about for generations. David had been flying Alaska's backcountry for over 20 years, navigating some of the most treacherous weather conditions and remote terrain in North America. His reputation among hunters, researchers, and remote communities was impeccable. He could land his modified Cessna 180 on makeshift strips that other pilots wouldn't dare attempt, and he had an uncanny ability to read weather patterns that had saved countless lives over the years. David understood Alaska's wilderness better than most people understood their own neighborhoods, which made what happened to him that October night all the more unsettling. The flight that would change David's life forever began as a routine supply run to a remote research station located nearly 300 miles northwest of Fairbanks. The station was monitoring seismic activity in the region, and David had been contracted to deliver equipment replacements and food supplies that would sustain the three-person team through the approaching winter. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds, perfect flying conditions for what should have been a straightforward 4-hour round trip. David's troubles began shortly after takeoff, when his radio equipment started malfunctioning, producing strange static patterns and picking up transmissions in languages he couldn't identify. Initially, he attributed the interference to solar activity affecting radio propagation, a common occurrence during periods of heightened aurora activity. But as he flew deeper into the wilderness, the radio interference became more disturbing. Voices that seemed to be calling his name, conversations in what sounded like indigenous languages mixed with modern English, and most unsettling of all, transmissions that seemed to be coming from his own aircraft, despite the fact that he wasn't broadcasting. As darkness fell and the northern lights began their spectacular display across the sky, David noticed that his compass was behaving erratically, spinning wildly and unable to maintain a consistent heading. His GPS unit was showing impossible readings, displaying coordinates that would place him simultaneously in multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. More troubling still, the aurora display seemed to be responding to his aircraft's movements, intensifying when he changed altitude or direction, as if the lights themselves were tracking his progress through the night sky. The first indication that David was encountering something beyond normal atmospheric phenomena came when he spotted lights on the ground that shouldn't have existed. According to his flight plan and topographical maps, he was flying over uninhabited wilderness with no settlements, roads, or electrical infrastructure for hundreds of miles. Yet spread across the landscape below were clusters of lights arranged in patterns that suggested organized communities. Not the random scattering of individual cabins or campsites, but structured settlements with what appeared to be streets, buildings, and even vehicles moving between the illuminated areas. David's training and experience told him to investigate these anomalous settlements, thinking they might represent crashed aircraft or stranded travelers in need of assistance. As he descended for a closer look, the aurora activity intensified dramatically, creating pillars of green and blue light that seemed to connect the mysterious ground settlements to the dancing lights in the sky above. The radio interference reached overwhelming levels, with dozens of voices speaking simultaneously in languages that seemed both ancient and futuristic, creating a cacophony that filled his headphones with urgent communications he couldn't understand. When David reached an altitude of roughly 2,000 feet above the mysterious settlements, he could see details that defied logical explanation. The buildings below appeared to be constructed from materials that reflected and amplified the aurora light, creating structures that seemed to glow with their own internal illumination. People were moving through the settlement, but their movements were too fluid and coordinated, like choreographed dancers rather than individuals going about normal activities. Most disturbing of all, some of these figures appeared to be floating slightly above the ground, moving in perfect synchronization with the aurora patterns overhead. David's attempts to photograph the settlements were frustrated by equipment failures. His camera would malfunction whenever he tried to document what he was seeing, producing only blank images or distorted pictures that showed normal wilderness terrain instead of the illuminated communities spread below. His attempts to radio for assistance or report his discoveries were equally unsuccessful, as his transmissions seemed to be absorbed by the overwhelming interference that now dominated all radio frequencies. As David circled the area, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing, the aurora display began forming geometric patterns that seemed deliberately constructed rather than naturally occurring. The lights created perfect circles, triangles, and complex mandala-like formations that pulsed in rhythm with the activities in the settlements below. David began to realize that he was witnessing some kind of communication or coordination between the ground-based phenomena and the atmospheric lights, as if the aurora itself was being controlled or directed by intelligent forces. The situation became truly terrifying when David noticed that additional aircraft were appearing in the sky around him. Planes and helicopters that materialized out of the aurora light, as if they had been hidden within the electromagnetic display. These aircraft moved with impossible maneuvers, accelerating and changing direction in ways that violated aerodynamic principles. Some appeared to be vintage aircraft from decades past, while others looked like modern military helicopters or experimental aircraft that he didn't recognize. All of them seemed to be piloted, but attempts to establish radio contact produced only the strange multilingual transmissions that had been plaguing his communications. David found himself being escorted or herded by these phantom aircraft toward one of the larger settlements, despite his attempts to change course or climb to a higher altitude. His engine was running normally, his controls were responsive, but somehow his aircraft was being drawn inexorably toward a landing strip that was illuminated by the aurora light and seemed to have materialized specifically for his arrival. The realization that he was being guided by forces beyond his control triggered a panic response that finally broke through whatever influence was affecting his decision-making. Using skills developed through decades of flying in emergency situations, David pushed his aircraft to its performance limits, diving toward lower altitude and executing radical maneuvers designed to break free from whatever was guiding him toward the mysterious settlement. The phantom aircraft pursued him, maintaining impossible formations and speeds while the aurora display overhead became increasingly chaotic and violent, creating light patterns that hurt to look at directly and seemed to induce disorientation and nausea. David's escape came when he remembered stories his Athabascan friends had told him about protective ceremonies and mental techniques used by traditional hunters to ward off supernatural influences. Despite his rational mind's resistance to such concepts, desperation drove him to begin reciting traditional prayers and protective chants that he had learned during his years of friendship with native guides and elders. As he spoke the ancient words, the phantom aircraft began losing their coordinated behavior. The aurora display started returning to more natural patterns, and the mysterious settlements below began fading like mirages, disappearing at sunrise. The remainder of David's flight passed without incident, except for the complete failure of his radio equipment and navigational instruments. He was forced to navigate by dead reckoning and visual landmarks, eventually reaching his intended destination nearly 6 hours behind schedule. The research station personnel who were expecting his supply delivery reported that they had been unable to establish radio contact and had begun preparing emergency procedures in case he had crashed or become lost in the wilderness. When David attempted to report his experiences to aviation authorities and fellow pilots, he discovered that official weather records showed no unusual aurora activity during his flight, and satellite imagery of the region showed only normal wilderness terrain, with no signs of settlements or artificial illumination. His aircraft's flight recorder had malfunctioned during the critical period, producing only static and electronic noise instead of the expected navigation data and radio communications. The psychological impact of David's encounter was profound and long-lasting. He found himself unable to fly during periods of aurora activity, developing an almost phobic reaction to the northern lights that had once been a source of wonder and beauty. His sleep was plagued by dreams of the glowing settlements and phantom aircraft, and he began experiencing episodes where he would find himself speaking in the strange languages he had heard during the radio interference, even though he had no memory of learning these words or understanding their meaning. David's research into his experience led him to discover that indigenous communities throughout Alaska had legends about the aurora borealis that described it not as a natural phenomenon, but as evidence of spiritual activity in the upper atmosphere. According to these traditional stories, the northern lights were created by the spirits of children who had died before their time, dancing in the sky above the earth. Some legends went further, describing how these child spirits could influence the living world, creating temporary communities and gathering places that existed between the physical and spiritual realms. Elder members of various native communities, when approached with respectful inquiry about David's experience, acknowledged that such encounters were part of their oral traditions, but were rarely discussed with outsiders. They explained that the aurora spirits sometimes revealed themselves to individuals who had the proper spiritual sensitivity, or who found themselves in locations where the barrier between worlds was particularly thin. These encounters were not necessarily malevolent, but they could be overwhelming for people who lacked proper preparation or understanding of the spiritual forces involved. David's attempts to verify his experience through independent investigation proved frustratingly inconclusive. Other pilots reported unusual radio interference and navigation problems during periods of high aurora activity, but none described encounters as dramatic or detailed as his. Searches of the area where he had witnessed the phantom settlements revealed only normal wilderness terrain, though some expeditions reported finding unusual electromagnetic readings and unexplained archaeological artifacts that suggested ancient human activity in regions previously thought to be uninhabited. The scientific community's response to David's account was predictably skeptical, attributing his experience to a combination of fatigue, electromagnetic interference affecting his perception, and the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to aurora light. Researchers pointed out that electromagnetic activity associated with the northern lights could indeed cause hallucinations, equipment malfunctions, and disorientation, providing rational explanations for many aspects of his reported encounter. However, David's reputation as a careful and experienced pilot prevented complete dismissal of his account, and his detailed description of the radio transmissions in indigenous languages led some researchers to investigate connections between aurora activity and traditional native spiritual practices. These studies revealed intriguing correlations between periods of intense aurora activity and increased reports of spiritual experiences among Alaska Native communities. though no definitive causal relationships could be established. David continued flying professionally for several more years, but he never again encountered phenomena similar to his October 1978 experience. He developed a reputation among other pilots and native communities as someone who had been touched by the aurora spirits and survived to tell about it. Some sought him out for advice about unusual experiences during aurora displays, while others avoided flying with him, believing that his encounter had marked him in ways that might attract further supernatural attention. The mystery of what David experienced that night remains unsolved, existing in the gray area between documented anomaly and spiritual encounter. His story has become part of Alaska's collection of unexplained phenomena, passed down through pilot communities and native oral traditions as a reminder that the Northern Lights may harbor secrets far more complex and mysterious than mainstream science acknowledges. Whether David encountered some unknown atmospheric phenomenon, experienced a profound hallucination triggered by electromagnetic effects, or genuinely made contact with spiritual forces that indigenous peoples have known about for centuries, his story serves as a powerful reminder that Alaska's wilderness contains mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. In a land where the aurora borealis can turn the entire sky into a dancing canvas of otherworldly light, the line between natural phenomenon and supernatural encounter becomes blurred in ways that force even the most rational minds to question their assumptions about what is possible. Today, David's account continues to influence how some people experience and interpret the Northern Lights, adding an element of spiritual possibility to a phenomenon that most view as purely scientific. His story stands as testament to the idea that Alaska's wilderness may contain doorways between different levels of reality, places where the material world intersects with spiritual dimensions that most of us never glimpse, but some are destined to encounter when conditions align in just the right way. Our sixth story takes us underground into one of Alaska's most classified Cold War secrets, where military psychology experiments cross the line between science and torture, leaving behind a legacy of horror that still haunts those brave enough to enter its depths. In 1981, a construction crew working on telecommunications infrastructure near Elmendorf Air Force Base discovered an abandoned military facility that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the limits of human experimentation and psychological manipulation. The bunker complex, designated as Project Arctic Mind, was constructed in 1962 beneath what appeared to be a routine military communications facility, designed to be completely invisible from aerial reconnaissance and hidden even from most personnel stationed at the base above. The facility consisted of 3 underground levels, extending nearly 80 feet below ground, accessible only through a concealed entrance that required high-level security clearance to open. According to classified documents later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the bunker was officially designated as a psychological research facility, designed to test the effects of extreme isolation on military personnel who might face similar conditions during extended Arctic operations. The construction crew that first entered the abandoned facility was led by Frank Morrison, a veteran electrician who had worked on military installations throughout Alaska for over 15 years. Morrison and his team had been contracted to install fiber optic cables through the area when their ground-penetrating radar detected the anomalous underground structure. Initial attempts to contact base authorities about the obstruction were met with confusion and denial. According to current base personnel, no such facility existed in their area, and their maps showed only solid bedrock where Morrison's equipment indicated a substantial underground complex. When Morrison's team finally gained access to the bunker through a concealed entrance that required hydraulic equipment to force open, they discovered a facility that seemed frozen in time, preserved exactly as it had been abandoned nearly 20 years earlier. The upper level contained what appeared to be standard military offices and living quarters. But the lower levels revealed a sophisticated psychological research complex equipped with observation chambers, sensory deprivation tanks, electromagnetic field generators, and isolation cells designed with meticulous attention to psychological torture techniques. The most disturbing discovery came in the facility's extensive documentation archives, which had been left completely intact, as if the researchers had simply vanished in the middle of their work. These files detailed a series of experiments conducted between 1962 and 1967 that involved systematic psychological breaking of volunteer test subjects, many of whom were military personnel who had been told they were participating in routine survival training exercises. The experiments were designed to determine how long human beings could maintain their sanity under conditions of complete sensory deprivation, electromagnetic manipulation, and carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. According to the recovered documentation, the research was conducted under the supervision of Dr. Leonard Hartwell, a psychiatrist who had previously worked with CIA programs investigating mind control techniques and psychological warfare applications. Dr. Hartwell's notes described a progressive series of experiments designed to push test subjects beyond normal human psychological limits, using Alaska's extreme isolation as a natural laboratory for studying the effects of prolonged confinement and sensory manipulation on military personnel. The first phase of experiments involved standard isolation protocols, where subjects were placed in soundproof chambers for periods ranging from several days to several weeks, with their psychological responses monitored through hidden cameras and electronic surveillance equipment. These initial tests established baseline responses to isolation and provided researchers with detailed profiles of how different personality types responded to prolonged confinement. However, Dr. Hartwell's notes indicate that these standard isolation techniques proved insufficient for his research objectives, leading to increasingly extreme experimental methods. Phase 2. Experiments incorporated electromagnetic field manipulation, designed to interfere with subjects' brain function and create artificial psychological disturbances. The facility was equipped with specialized equipment capable of generating low-frequency electromagnetic pulses that could induce hallucinations, paranoia, and disorientation in test subjects without their knowledge. Dr. Hartwell's documentation describes these electromagnetic protocols as environmental conditioning, designed to simulate the psychological effects that might result from enemy psychological warfare techniques or exposure to unknown atmospheric conditions in remote Arctic environments. The most disturbing phase of the research involved what Dr. Hartwell termed identity dissolution experiments, where subjects were systematically stripped of their sense of self through a combination of sensory deprivation, chemical manipulation, and psychological programming techniques. These experiments were designed to determine whether military personnel could be conditioned to maintain operational effectiveness even after experiencing complete psychological breakdown, essentially testing whether soldiers could function as effective combatants after their personalities had been artificially reconstructed. Morrison's construction crew discovered detailed video documentation of these experiments stored on magnetic tape reels in climate-controlled archives throughout the facility. The recordings showed test subjects undergoing systematic psychological torture that included prolonged sensory deprivation, exposure to disorienting electromagnetic fields, administration of experimental pharmaceutical compounds, and psychological programming techniques that involved playing recorded messages continuously for days or weeks while subjects were restrained in isolation chambers. The video evidence revealed that many test subjects experienced complete psychological collapse during the experiments, developing permanent mental health conditions that ranged from severe paranoia to complete catatonic states. Dr. Hartwell's clinical notes documented these breakdowns in clinical detail, describing them as successful data points, rather than human tragedies, and indicating that subjects who suffered permanent psychological damage were considered acceptable casualties in pursuit of scientific advancement. Perhaps most disturbing were the recordings that documented the final phase of experiments conducted in 1967, where Dr. Hartwell attempted to use the facility's electromagnetic equipment to induce what he termed controlled psychotic episodes in test subjects. These experiments involved exposing subjects to increasingly powerful electromagnetic fields while monitoring their brain activity, with the goal of triggering specific types of hallucinations and psychological disturbances that could be activated remotely using electromagnetic signals. Morrison reported that viewing these recordings had a profound psychological impact on his construction crew, with several team members requiring counseling after witnessing the documented torture and human experimentation. The videos showed test subjects begging to be released, experiencing obvious psychological distress, and in several cases, suffering what appeared to be complete mental breakdown. While researchers continued their observations without intervening to provide medical assistance or psychological support, the facility's research records indicated that the Arctic Mine Project was abruptly terminated in late 1967, following an incident that Dr. Hartwell's final reports describe only as catastrophic experimental failure. According to his last documented entry, dated November 15, 1967, the electromagnetic equipment had been pushed beyond its design parameters during attempts to induce controlled hallucinations in multiple subjects simultaneously, resulting in what he termed uncontrollable psychological manifestations that threatened the safety of research personnel. Dr. Hartwell's final report described subjects experiencing shared hallucinations that seemed to persist even after electromagnetic exposure had ended, suggesting that the experimental protocols had triggered psychological phenomena that researchers couldn't understand or control. His notes indicate that several test subjects had begun exhibiting what appeared to be telepathic communication abilities, sharing identical hallucinations and demonstrating knowledge of information they couldn't have acquired through normal sensory channels. The documentation suggested that the final experiment had created conditions where the boundary between individual consciousness and shared psychological experience had broken down, with test subjects apparently experiencing a form of collective psychosis that Dr. Hartwell couldn't explain using existing psychological theories. His final notes expressed growing concern that the electromagnetic manipulation had triggered psychological phenomena that existed outside the parameters of conventional scientific understanding. Morrison's team discovered that the facility had been hastily abandoned following this final experiment, with equipment left running and research materials scattered as if personnel had fled in panic, rather than conducting an orderly shutdown of operations. Personal belongings, research notes, and even food remains were found throughout the facility, suggesting that evacuation had been conducted under emergency conditions with no time for proper decommissioning procedures. The fate of Dr. Hartwell and his research team remained a mystery until Morrison's crew discovered a concealed area in the facility's lowest level that contained additional documentation and evidence of what had happened during the final days of the Arctic Mine Project. According to these recovered materials, Dr. Hartwell and several research assistants had apparently volunteered to undergo the same experimental procedures they had been inflicting on their test subjects, believing that direct experience with the electromagnetic protocols would provide crucial scientific insights. The final documentation indicated that Dr. Hartwell had exposed himself to the facility's most powerful electromagnetic field generators while monitoring his own psychological responses, apparently believing that he could maintain scientific objectivity even while experiencing the psychological manipulation techniques he had developed. His handwritten notes from this self-experimentation phase became increasingly erratic and incoherent, describing experiences that seem to blur the line between scientific observation and complete psychological breakdown. Morrison reported that the most disturbing discovery in the facility's lower level was a series of audio recordings that captured Dr. Hartwell's final days, including documentation of his progressive psychological deterioration as he subjected himself to his own experimental protocols. These recordings revealed that Dr. Hartwell had become convinced that his electromagnetic experiments had opened some kind of doorway between different levels of consciousness, allowing access to psychological dimensions that human beings weren't meant to experience. The audio documentation described Dr. Hartwell's growing belief that the facility itself had become psychologically contaminated by years of psychological torture and electromagnetic manipulation, creating an environment where normal psychological boundaries no longer functioned properly. His final recordings suggested that he and his research team had become trapped within their own experimental protocols, unable to distinguish between induced hallucinations and authentic psychological experiences. Morrison's construction crew attempted to remove the documentation and equipment from the facility for analysis by military authorities, but they discovered that prolonged exposure to the bunker environment was having disturbing psychological effects on their team members. Several crew members reported experiencing vivid hallucinations, shared nightmares, and episodes of missing time while working in the facility, suggesting that whatever psychological contamination Dr. Hartwell had documented was still active nearly 15 years after the facility's abandonment. The military's response to Morrison's discovery was swift and comprehensive, with the facility being sealed and classified under national security protocols that prevented further civilian access or investigation. Morrison and his team were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and undergo psychological evaluation to determine whether their exposure to the facility had caused any lasting mental health effects. Several team members reported ongoing psychological disturbances for years after their exposure to the bunker, including recurring nightmares, episodes of paranoia, and persistent feelings that they were being observed or monitored. Official military statements described the facility as a decommissioned Cold War research installation and denied that any unethical experimentation had been conducted there. But Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists and researchers have revealed extensive documentation confirming the existence of the Arctic Mine Project and its systematic psychological torture of military personnel. These documents provided evidence that similar facilities existed throughout Alaska during the Cold War period, suggesting that the bunker discovered by Morrison's team was part of a larger network of psychological research installations. The bunker remained sealed and classified, with its exact location concealed from public knowledge. But former military personnel who served in Alaska during the 1960s have reported being aware of psychological research programs that involved extensive human experimentation and testing of electromagnetic manipulation techniques. Some veterans have described being subjected to experimental protocols that matched Dr. Hartwell's documented procedures, providing independent confirmation that the Arctic Mine Project represented systematic psychological torture disguised as scientific research. Morrison retired from construction work following his discovery of the facility, reporting that his exposure to the bunker had left him with permanent psychological effects that made it impossible for him to work in confined spaces or underground environments. He spent the remainder of his career advocating for veterans who reported being subjected to military psychological experimentation, arguing that Dr. Hartwell's research represented systematic human rights violations that were concealed under the guise of legitimate scientific inquiry. The legacy of the Arctic Mine Project continues to influence discussions about military ethics and human experimentation, serving as a reminder that institutional authority and scientific legitimacy can be used to justify the most horrific abuses of human dignity and psychological integrity. The bunker below Elmendorf Air Force Base stands as a monument to the darkest aspects of military psychology research, where the pursuit of psychological warfare capabilities led to systematic torture that violated every principle of ethical scientific research. Today, the sealed facility remains a classified site that officially doesn't exist, but its documentation continues to surface through Freedom of Information Act requests and whistleblower revelations that provide ongoing evidence of the systematic psychological torture conducted in Alaska during the Cold War period. The story of Dr. Hartwell's experiments serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked military research and the human cost of psychological warfare development, reminding us that some secrets are buried underground not to protect national security, but to conceal crimes against humanity that were committed in the name of scientific advancement. Our seventh story takes us back to Alaska's lawless gold rush era, where greed and desperation created a mining camp massacre that would haunt the wilderness for over a century. In the winter of 1907, what began as a dispute over claim jumping in the remote Chititu mining district escalated into one of Alaska's most brutal mass murders, leaving behind a legacy of violence that some say still echoes through the abandoned camps scattered across the Alaskan wilderness. The Chititu mining district in south-central Alaska attracted hundreds of fortune seekers during the early 1900s, drawn by reports of rich placer deposits hidden in the remote valleys near the Wrangell Mountains. Unlike the more famous Klondike Rush, the Chititu camps were isolated by hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain, accessible only during summer months and completely cut off from law enforcement or outside assistance during the brutal winter seasons. This isolation created perfect conditions for the kind of lawless violence that characterized Alaska's mining frontier, where disputes were settled with guns rather than courts, and where missing men were often assumed to have simply moved on to the next promising strike. The central figure in our story was Magnus Olsson, a Norwegian immigrant who had spent 3 years developing what he believed was the richest claim in the entire district. Olsson had discovered a promising gravel bar along Chititu Creek that consistently produced several ounces of gold per day during the peak mining season, making him one of the few miners in the area who was actually turning a substantial profit from his backbreaking work. His success bred resentment among less fortunate miners, particularly during the harsh winter of 1906 to 1907, when food supplies ran low and many men faced starvation in their isolated cabins. The trouble began in late November 1907, when Olsson discovered that someone had been working his claim during his absence, stealing equipment and processing gravels that should have been his exclusive property. Footprints in the snow and evidence of unauthorized sluicing operations indicated that multiple men were involved in the systematic theft. But the perpetrators had been careful to cover their tracks and work only when Olsson was away from his claim. The violation of mining claim boundaries was considered one of the most serious crimes in frontier Alaska, traditionally punishable by immediate banishment from the mining district or, in extreme cases, summary execution by vigilante justice. Olsson's investigation led him to suspect a group of 7 men who had arrived in the district late in the season without adequate supplies or equipment, suggesting they were desperate enough to risk claim jumping rather than face starvation during the long winter months. Led by a former California miner named Thomas Brennan, this group had established a camp roughly 2 miles downstream from Olsson's claim, close enough to observe his activities and strike his workings during his frequent trips to gather firewood and hunt for fresh meat. Brennan and his associates were known throughout the district as troublemakers who had been involved in several violent disputes over mining rights and gambling debts. The confrontation that would trigger the massacre occurred on December 15, 1907, when Olsson caught 3 of Brennan's men red-handed while they were operating his sluice box and processing stolen gravels from his most productive mining area. armed with a Winchester rifle and supported by 2 fellow miners who had witnessed the theft. Olson demanded that the claim jumpers return his stolen gold and immediately leave the district permanently. The heated argument that followed escalated when Brennan's men claimed they had legitimate rights to work the disputed ground, producing forged documents that purported to show prior claims to the area. Rather than accept Olson's demand for immediate departure, Brennan's group began making threats against his life, warning that accidents could easily happen to isolated miners during the dangerous winter months ahead. These threats were taken seriously in a region where men disappeared regularly, and their bodies were often not discovered until spring thaw revealed frozen corpses scattered throughout the wilderness. Olson realized that simply driving off the claim jumpers would not solve his problem. They would likely return with reinforcements and attempt to murder him and seize his valuable claim permanently. The situation deteriorated further over the following week, as both sides began recruiting allies and stockpiling weapons in preparation for what seemed like inevitable violence. Olson managed to convince 4 other successful miners that Brennan's group represented a threat to all legitimate claim holders in the district, arguing that allowing claim jumping to go unpunished would encourage other desperate men to resort to theft and violence rather than honest mining work. Meanwhile, Brennan recruited additional supporters from among the district's less successful miners, promising them shares in Olson's rich claim if they helped him eliminate the Norwegian and his allies. The massacre began just after midnight on December 22, 1907, when Olson and his supporters launched a surprise attack on Brennan's camp, believing they could end the conflict quickly by eliminating the ringleaders before the situation spread to involve the entire mining district. Armed with rifles, shotguns, and dynamite stolen from mining operations, Olson's group approached the sleeping camp under cover of darkness and opened fire on the canvas tents and crude log shelters where Brennan's men were sleeping. The initial assault killed 3 men instantly, but the survivors managed to return fire and take defensive positions behind overturned sleds and supply caches, turning the surprise attack into a prolonged gun battle that raged throughout the night. The sound of continuous gunfire echoed through the frozen valleys, alerting other miners throughout the district that serious violence was occurring. But the extreme cold and dangerous traveling conditions prevented anyone from intervening in the deadly conflict. As dawn broke over the mining camp, both sides had suffered casualties, but neither was willing to surrender or negotiate a peaceful resolution to their dispute. Olson's group controlled the high ground overlooking Brennan's camp, but the survivors were well armed and determined to fight to the death, rather than face vigilante justice for their claim-jumping activities. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Olson made the fateful decision to use mining explosives to end the siege permanently. The dynamite attack that ended the Battle of Chititu Creek was both devastating and indiscriminate, destroying most of Brennan's camp and killing several men who might have been taken prisoner under different circumstances. When Olson's group advanced to examine the devastation, they discovered that some of Brennan's supporters were still alive but severely wounded, presenting the dilemma of whether to provide medical assistance or eliminate witnesses who might report their vigilante activities to territorial authorities. The decision to execute the wounded survivors transformed what might have been justified self-defense into cold-blooded murder, crossing a moral line that would haunt the participants for the remainder of their lives. According to later testimony from the sole survivor who escaped into the wilderness, Olson personally shot 3 wounded men who were begging for mercy, while his supporters methodically searched the destroyed camp for any signs of life and eliminated anyone they found still breathing. The cover-up that followed the massacre was as systematic as the violence itself, with Olson's group working for days to eliminate all evidence of the battle and dispose of the bodies in ways that would prevent discovery when other miners returned to the district in spring. The corpses were dismembered and scattered throughout the wilderness, with some remains thrown into abandoned mine shafts and others buried in remote locations that would be difficult to locate, even with careful searching. When territorial investigators arrived in the Shititu district the following summer to investigate reports of missing miners, they found Brennan's camp had been completely destroyed by what Olson claimed was an accidental fire that occurred during extremely cold weather when desperate men tried to heat their shelters with dangerous makeshift stoves. The official investigation was hampered by the isolation of the area, the lack of surviving witnesses, and the tendency of frontier miners to handle their disputes privately without involving outside authorities. However, the psychological impact of participating in mass murder began taking its toll on Olson's supporters, with several men developing drinking problems, exhibiting symptoms of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, and making cryptic references to terrible events that occurred during the winter of 1907. One participant, driven by guilt and nightmares, eventually confessed his involvement to a Catholic priest in Fairbanks, providing details that confirmed suspicions about the fate of Brennan's group. The confession led to renewed investigation of the Shititu massacre. But by that time, most of the participants had either died, disappeared, or left Alaska permanently, making prosecution impossible despite compelling evidence that multiple murders had occurred. Olson himself was found dead in his cabin during the winter of 1909, apparently killed by a single gunshot wound that authorities ruled was either suicide or murder by unknown assailants seeking revenge for the 1907 massacre. The abandoned mining camps in the Shititu district began developing a reputation for being haunted by the victims of the massacre, with later miners reporting strange phenomena that suggested the violent deaths had left some kind of supernatural imprint on the area. Visitors to the remote camps described hearing gunshots echoing through the valleys during calm weather, discovering camps that appeared to have been recently occupied despite being abandoned for years, and encountering shadowy figures that disappeared when approached directly. These reports became more frequent and detailed as the decades passed, with multiple witnesses describing encounters with what appeared to be the ghosts of murdered miners reenacting their final desperate battle. Some visitors claimed to have heard voices speaking in Norwegian and other foreign languages, apparently arguing about mining claims and territorial disputes that had ended with death nearly a century earlier. Others reported finding fresh graves and recently disturbed mining equipment in areas where no living person could have been working. The most disturbing accounts came from hunters and hikers who spent nights camping in the abandoned Shititu camps, reporting sleep disruption caused by sounds of fighting, screaming, and explosions that seemed to originate from the historical massacre site. Several visitors claimed to have been awakened by the sounds of men begging for mercy in foreign accents, followed by gunshots that left no physical evidence but created psychological trauma that required professional counseling to overcome. Modern paranormal investigators who have visited the Shititu district report electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and audio recordings that capture voices and sounds that cannot be attributed to natural phenomena or contemporary human activity. Photographic evidence allegedly shows apparitions of miners dressed in early 1900s clothing, though skeptics argue these images result from photographic artifacts or deliberate manipulation rather than genuine supernatural manifestations. The historical significance of the Shititu massacre extends beyond its supernatural reputation to provide insight into the violent culture that characterized Alaska's mining frontier during the early territorial period. The willingness of otherwise law-abiding men to resort to mass murder over mining disputes demonstrates the desperation and lawlessness that existed in regions beyond the reach of effective government authority, where survival often depended on the ability to use violence more effectively than one's neighbors. Archaeological surveys of the Shititu mining district continue to uncover evidence consistent with the massacre accounts, including bullet casings, fragments of mining equipment damaged by explosions, and human remains that show signs of violent death. These discoveries provide physical confirmation of the violence that occurred in the area, though they cannot definitively prove the supernatural elements that have become associated with the abandoned camps. The psychological impact of the Shititu massacre on Alaska's mining community was profound and long-lasting, contributing to the development of informal codes of conduct that were designed to prevent similar escalations of mining disputes into deadly violence. These unwritten rules emphasized arbitration through respected community leaders, shared responsibility for maintaining law and order, and collective action to prevent desperate individuals from resorting to claim, jumping, and other criminal activities. The legacy of Magnus Olsson and the Shititu massacre serves as a reminder that Alaska's gold rush era was characterized not only by adventure and opportunity, but also by violence, desperation, and moral compromise that left permanent scars on both the physical landscape and the collective memory of the mining community. The abandoned camps scattered throughout Alaska's wilderness represent not just failed economic ventures, but sites where human greed and desperation led to tragedies that may have created lasting supernatural phenomena. Today, the Shititu mining district remains largely inaccessible to casual visitors, protected by its remote location and harsh environmental conditions that continue to discourage exploration and development. However, those who do venture into the area often report feeling an oppressive atmosphere that suggests the violent events of 1907 have left an indelible mark on the landscape, creating a haunted wilderness where the ghosts of murdered miners may still be fighting their desperate battle for gold and survival. The story of the Shititu massacre demonstrates how Alaska's vast wilderness can preserve not only physical evidence of historical events, but also psychological and supernatural residues that continue to affect those who encounter them more than a century later. In a land where violence and death were common occurrences during the territorial period, some locations seem to have absorbed the trauma of past events in ways that defy rational explanation, creating haunted landscapes where the boundary between history and horror becomes disturbingly unclear. Whether the reported supernatural phenomena in the Shititu district represent genuine ghostly activity, psychological reactions to historical trauma, or simple misinterpretation of natural phenomena in a spooky environment, the massacre itself remains a well-documented example of how quickly civilization can break down in frontier conditions. The willingness of ordinary men to commit mass murder over mining claims reveals the dark side of Alaska's gold rush mythology, reminding us that the pursuit of fortune in the wilderness often came at a terrible human cost that may still be exacting its toll on those who venture into Alaska's most haunted corners. Dr. Anna led the 5-person research team that had been dispatched to Alaska's North Slope by the National Science Foundation to study the effects of accelerated permafrost melting on carbon release and climate change. Dr. Anna was a respected climatologist from the University of Colorado who had spent over a decade studying Arctic environmental changes, and her team included specialized researchers in geology, biology, atmospheric chemistry, and permafrost dynamics. Their mission was straightforward: collect core samples from areas where permafrost was melting at unprecedented rates, analyze the released organic compounds, and provide data that would help scientists understand how rapidly thawing Arctic ground might accelerate global climate change. The research site Dr. Anna selected was located roughly 40 miles southeast of Utqiagvik, where satellite imagery and ground temperature monitoring had identified one of the fastest permafrost melt zones documented in Alaska. The area showed signs of dramatic ground subsidence, with what had been solid frozen ground for millennia now turning into unstable bogs and methane-releasing wetlands during the brief Arctic summer. The team established their base camp in early September, planning to complete their sample collection before the onset of winter weather made further work impossible. The first indication that they had encountered something unusual came when Dr. Anna's team began drilling their initial core samples from areas where the permafrost was melting most rapidly. Instead of finding the expected layers of ancient organic matter, ice, and geological deposits, their drilling equipment encountered what appeared to be a large cavity roughly 15 feet below the surface. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed that they had discovered a substantial hollow space that extended for hundreds of yards in multiple directions, suggesting they had found some kind of natural cave system that had been hidden beneath the frozen ground for centuries or millennia. The team's geologist, Marcus Chen, reported that the cavity appeared to contain liquid water, despite the fact that temperatures at that depth should have been well below freezing year-round. More puzzling still, the water showed unusual chemical signatures when analyzed using their portable testing equipment. Abnormally high concentrations of organic compounds that suggested the presence of decomposing biological matter, but in combinations that didn't match any known Arctic ecosystems or geological processes. Dr. Anna made the decision to excavate a wider access shaft that would allow team members to descend into the underground cavity and directly examine whatever was causing the unusual chemical readings. The excavation work proceeded rapidly due to the softened permafrost, revealing a natural limestone cave system that had apparently been sealed beneath the frozen ground since the last ice age. The cave's interior maintained a temperature just above freezing, warmed by geothermal activity from deep underground springs that had prevented complete freezing despite Alaska's harsh surface climate. When Dr. Anna and two team members first descended into the cave system using climbing equipment and portable lighting, they discovered an environment that challenged their understanding of Arctic biology and geology. The cave walls were covered with unusual mineral deposits that seemed to pulse with faint bioluminescence, creating an eerie blue-green glow that made their flashlights seem almost unnecessary. The air inside the cave carried a distinctly organic smell, not the clean odor of fresh water or minerals, but something that suggested decay and biological activity on a massive scale. The source of the mysterious chemical signatures became apparent when the team reached the cave's main chamber, roughly 50 feet below ground level. The cavern contained a substantial underground lake fed by warm springs, but the water was filled with organic matter that defied immediate classification. Floating throughout the dark water were masses of what appeared to be preserved biological tissue, not frozen like the typical organic matter found in permafrost, but somehow maintained in a state of arrested decay by the cave's unique environmental conditions. Dr. Anna's team collected water samples and tissue specimens for immediate field analysis, discovering that the organic matter contained DNA sequences that didn't match any known species in existing genetic databases. The tissue samples appeared to be from large animals, possibly mammalian, but the genetic markers suggested species that had been extinct for thousands of years. More disturbing still, some of the tissue samples showed signs of recent cellular activity despite their obviously ancient origins, as if the cave's environment had somehow preserved not just the physical structure of the organisms, but also some form of dormant biological function. The team's biologist, Jennifer Walsh, reported that microscopic examination of the tissue samples revealed cellular structures that appeared to be actively metabolizing, consuming nutrients from the cave water, and reproducing at extremely slow rates. This discovery suggested that whatever creatures had died in the cave system had never completely ceased biological activity, instead entering some kind of suspended animation that allowed them to persist for millennia while gradually adapting to their underground environment. As the team continued their investigation over the following days, they began noticing changes in the cave environment that suggested their presence was somehow activating dormant biological processes. The bioluminescence in the mineral deposits increased in intensity. The temperature of the underground lake began rising measurably, and the organic matter in the water showed signs of increased metabolic activity. Most disturbing of all, some of the larger tissue masses began showing coordinated movement that couldn't be explained by water currents or chemical reactions. Dr. Anna's field notes from this period document growing concern about the potential risks of disturbing what appeared to be a perfectly balanced ecosystem that had existed undisturbed for thousands of years. The team's atmospheric chemist reported detecting unusual gas emissions from the cave system, not just the expected carbon dioxide and methane from organic decay, but complex organic compounds that suggested active biological processes involving unfamiliar biochemical pathways. The situation became truly alarming when team members began experiencing health symptoms that couldn't be attributed to normal exposure risks associated with cave exploration or permafrost research. Jennifer Walsh developed a persistent cough and reported difficulty breathing, despite showing no signs of respiratory infection or allergic reactions. Marcus Chen complained of severe headaches and disorientation that worsened whenever he spent extended periods in the cave system, while other team members reported vivid nightmares and disturbed sleep patterns that began shortly after their first descent into the underground chambers. Dr. Anna decided to suspend cave exploration and focus on analyzing their collected samples when she realized that the team's health problems might be related to exposure to unknown biological agents or toxic compounds from the ancient organic matter. Laboratory analysis of their tissue and water samples revealed the presence of complex proteins and enzymes that didn't correspond to any known biological systems, suggesting that the preserved organisms represented evolutionary pathways that had diverged from familiar life forms thousands of years ago. More troubling still, the samples continued to show increased biological activity even after being removed from the cave environment, suggesting that whatever adaptation mechanisms had allowed these organisms to survive in dormancy were now being activated by exposure to modern atmospheric conditions or human contact. The tissue samples began showing signs of rapid cellular division and structural reorganization, as if they were attempting to reconstitute themselves into more complex organisms. The team's final days at the research site were marked by increasingly bizarre and disturbing phenomena that challenged their scientific understanding of biology and environmental science. The cave system began producing sounds that resembled biological activity, not just the dripping of water or settling of rock, but rhythmic pulsing that suggested cardiac or respiratory functions operating on a massive scale. Team members reported seeing movement in the underground lake that involved coordinated behavior among the organic masses, as if individual tissue samples were beginning to merge into larger, more complex structures. Dr. Anna made the decision to evacuate the research site and report their discoveries to health authorities when Jennifer Walsh collapsed during what should have been routine sample collection, exhibiting symptoms that suggested exposure to powerful neurotoxins or hallucinogenic compounds. Medical examination revealed that Walsh had developed unusual cellular changes in her lung tissue that resembled the adaptive mutations they had observed in the ancient organic samples, suggesting that exposure to the cave environment was causing contemporary biological modifications in human tissue. The evacuation from the research site was complicated by rapidly changing weather conditions and the team's deteriorating health. But they managed to transport their samples and documentation to Utqiagvik for further analysis by specialized laboratories equipped to handle potentially dangerous biological specimens. However, during transport, several of the tissue samples began exhibiting behavior that suggested they were actively attempting to escape containment, demonstrating problem-solving capabilities and coordinated action that indicated intelligence far beyond simple cellular activity. Upon arrival in Utqiagvik, Dr. Anna's team was placed under medical quarantine, while health officials attempted to determine whether they had been exposed to dangerous pathogens or toxic compounds. The tissue samples were transferred to secure biological research facilities for analysis by specialists in ancient DNA, extremophiles biology, and biosafety protocols. However, within hours of arriving at the research facility, the samples had somehow breached their containment systems and vanished completely, leaving behind only organic residues that suggested rapid cellular dissolution or transformation. The official investigation into Dr. Anna's discovery was conducted by multiple agencies, including the Centers for Disease Control, the National Science Foundation, and military biological research units. But their findings were classified under national security protocols that prevented public disclosure of the team's discoveries. Dr. Anna and her team members were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and underwent prolonged medical monitoring to assess the long-term effects of their exposure to the unknown biological agents. Jennifer Walsh never fully recovered from her exposure to the cave environment, developing a progressive respiratory condition that seemed to involve ongoing cellular modifications similar to those observed in the ancient tissue samples. Her medical records, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, document unusual physiological changes that suggested her body was adapting to environmental conditions that didn't exist on Earth's surface, as if her cellular structure was being modified to survive in the underground ecosystem she had briefly encountered. The permafrost research site was declared off-limits by federal authorities and has been continuously monitored by remote sensing equipment since Dr. Anna's team. Evacuation. Satellite imagery shows that the area continues to experience accelerated melting and ground subsidence, with new cavities and underground spaces appearing regularly as the ancient cave system expands due to changing environmental conditions. Some monitoring data suggests ongoing biological activity in the area, with heat signatures and gas emissions that indicate active metabolic processes continuing to operate beneath the surface. Dr. Anna's career was effectively ended by her exposure to the cave system, as the ongoing health monitoring requirements and security restrictions made it impossible for her to continue normal research activities. She has become an advocate for more careful environmental protocols when studying permafrost melting, arguing that climate change may be releasing not just carbon and methane, but also biological agents that have been safely contained in frozen ground for millennia. The broader implications of Dr. Anna's discovery remain classified, but leaked documents suggest that similar sites may exist throughout Alaska's permafrost regions, potentially containing ancient biological systems that could pose unprecedented risks if released by continued climate warming. The possibility that permafrost melting could unleash not just greenhouse gases, but also unknown life forms that have evolved in isolation for thousands of years adds a new dimension to concerns about Arctic climate change. The fate of the organic matter that escaped from the research facility remains unknown, but there have been unconfirmed reports of unusual biological phenomena in areas surrounding Utqiagvik, including sightings of organisms that don't correspond to any known Arctic species and environmental changes that suggest the presence of invasive biological systems adapted to conditions that don't exist in contemporary ecosystems. Dr. Anna's story serves as a warning that climate change in Alaska may involve more than rising temperatures and melting ice. It may also involve the release of ancient biological systems that have been safely contained beneath the permafrost for millennia. As warming temperatures continue to thaw Alaska's frozen ground, scientists may discover that they are not just releasing carbon and methane, but also awakening forms of life that were never meant to interact with modern ecosystems or human biology. The thing in the permafrost may represent just the first of many discoveries that challenge our understanding of what lies hidden beneath Alaska's frozen surface, waiting for warmer temperatures to free it from its ancient prison. In a state where permafrost covers over 80% of the land surface, the potential for similar discoveries raises troubling questions about what other ancient secrets may be stirring to life as Alaska's climate continues to warm at twice the global average rate. Our ninth story takes us into the darkest depths of human isolation and psychological breakdown, where Alaska's brutal winter becomes the catalyst for a descent into madness that ends in unthinkable violence. In the winter of 2003, deep in the remote wilderness near McGrath, a man named Russell experienced a complete psychological collapse that would result in one of Alaska's most disturbing cases of isolation-induced homicide, proving that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wilderness is the human mind pushed beyond its breaking point. Russell had arrived in Alaska 3 years earlier as part of the wave of adventurers seeking to escape modern civilization and live off the grid in America's last frontier. Unlike many urban refugees who romanticized wilderness, living without understanding its harsh realities, Russell possessed genuine outdoor skills developed during his military service and subsequent years working as a hunting guide in Montana. He understood how to build adequate shelter, preserve food, hunt and trap effectively, and navigate using traditional methods when modern technology failed. His decision to spend the winter alone in a remote cabin wasn't the impulsive fantasy of a weekend outdoorsman, but the calculated choice of someone who believed he could handle the psychological and physical challenges of complete isolation. The cabin Russell selected for his winter retreat was located nearly 60 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by bush plane during summer months, and completely cut off from outside contact once deep snow made landing strips impassable. Built in the 1960s by a trapper who had since died, the structure was solid and well-designed for Alaska's extreme conditions. Thick log walls, efficient wood stove, adequate food storage, and enough space to prevent the claustrophobic conditions that could trigger psychological problems during months of confinement. Russell had spent the previous summer stockpiling supplies, repairing the cabin's roof and chinking, and establishing trap lines that would provide fresh meat and fur to supplement his preserved food stores. Russell's initial plan was methodical and reasonable. Spend the winter trapping, writing in a journal he hoped to eventually publish about his wilderness experience, and emerging in spring with enough furs to fund another year of independent living. He had informed friends in McGrath of his general location and planned to make contact via emergency beacon if serious problems developed. Though he emphasized his intention to handle any difficulties independently. Russell's personality before isolation was stable and confident. He was known as a reliable, good-natured man who got along well with other outdoorsmen and had never exhibited signs of mental instability or violent tendencies. The first indication that Russell was struggling with isolation came from entries in the journal later recovered from his cabin, which documented his psychological state throughout the winter. His early entries were optimistic and detailed, describing successful hunting, efficient cabin maintenance, and satisfaction with his chosen lifestyle. However, by December, roughly 6 weeks into his isolation, Russell's writing began showing signs of increasing paranoia and social anxiety that suggested the lack of human contact was affecting his mental stability more severely than he had anticipated. Russell's journal entries from late December described growing feelings that he was being watched by unseen observers, despite the logical certainty that no other humans could survive in the remote area during winter conditions. He wrote detailed accounts of hearing voices outside his cabin during severe blizzards, having conversations with imaginary companions, and becoming convinced that someone was systematically disturbing his trap lines and food caches. These hallucinations and paranoid delusions are classic symptoms of prolonged isolation. But Russell's military training and self-reliant personality prevented him from recognizing these experiences as psychological symptoms rather than real threats. By January, Russell's mental deterioration had accelerated dramatically. with his journal entries becoming increasingly erratic and filled with references to elaborate conspiracy theories about people who were supposedly attempting to steal his supplies and drive him from his territory. He began constructing defensive barriers around his cabin, setting traps designed to injure human intruders, and spending hours each day patrolling his area with loaded weapons while searching for evidence of the imaginary enemies his deteriorating mind insisted were stalking him. The isolation that had initially provided Russell with the independence he craved was now transforming him into a paranoid and potentially dangerous individual who could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. The journal entries from February revealed that Russell's paranoid delusions had evolved to include detailed backstories and motivations for his imaginary enemies, whom he described as competing trappers, government agents, and criminals who wanted to eliminate him and claim his territory. He wrote lengthy passages analyzing their supposed tactics, describing imaginary confrontations, and planning defensive strategies against threats that existed only in his deteriorating mind. Most disturbing of all, Russell began writing about his intention to eliminate these perceived enemies before they could harm him, indicating that his paranoid delusions were driving him toward violent action. The critical factor that transformed Russell's psychological breakdown from personal tragedy into homicidal violence was the unexpected arrival of another person at his cabin in late February. James Patterson, an experienced outdoorsman from Fairbanks, had been attempting a winter snowmobile journey across Alaska's interior. When mechanical problems forced him to seek shelter at Russell's remote location, Patterson knew the cabin existed from his own wilderness travels and hoped to make temporary repairs to his snowmobile while waiting for weather conditions that would allow him to complete his journey safely. His arrival at Russell's cabin should have been a fortunate coincidence that provided both men with companionship during the harsh winter months. However, Russell's paranoid mental state caused him to interpret Patterson's appearance as confirmation of his worst fears about being hunted by dangerous enemies. Instead of recognizing Patterson as a fellow outdoorsman in distress, Russell immediately concluded that his unexpected visitor was the leader of the conspiracy he believed had been developing against him for months. Russell's journal entries from this period show that he spent hours analyzing Patterson's explanations, equipment, and behavior for evidence of hidden motives, eventually convincing himself that Patterson had been sent to assassinate him and claim his supplies and territory. The psychological dynamics between the two men during Patterson's stay at the cabin were complex and tragic. With Patterson completely unaware of Russell's mental deterioration, and Russell interpreting every innocent action as evidence of malevolent intent. Patterson later told investigators that Russell seemed somewhat paranoid and socially awkward, which he attributed to normal effects of winter isolation. But he noticed no signs of serious mental illness or violent tendencies. Russell maintained a superficially normal facade during their conversations, while internally planning what he believed was necessary, preemptive self-defense against a dangerous enemy. Russell's journal documented his growing conviction that Patterson was planning to kill him during the night and steal everything he had worked to accumulate during his winter of isolation. The entries from Patterson's final days at the cabin show Russell analyzing his guests' sleep patterns, weapon access, and potential escape routes, while developing what he believed was a sophisticated counter-assassination plan designed to eliminate the threat before Patterson could act against him. The rational part of Russell's mind had been completely overwhelmed by paranoid delusions that transformed a friendly visitor into a mortal enemy who had to be destroyed. The murder occurred on February 28, 2003, when Russell shot Patterson in the back while he was preparing breakfast, believing he was preventing his own assassination by an enemy agent. Russell's journal entry describing the killing shows no remorse or recognition that he had murdered an innocent person. Instead, he wrote detailed analysis of how successfully he had anticipated and countered what he believed was Patterson's plan to eliminate him. The entry described Patterson's death as a necessary tactical victory rather than a human tragedy, indicating that Russell's mental breakdown was so complete that he could no longer access normal moral reasoning or emotional responses. After killing Patterson, Russell spent several days disposing of the body and eliminating evidence of his presence, treating the situation as an ongoing military operation rather than the aftermath of a senseless murder. His journal entries from this period show continued paranoid analysis of supposed threats, with Russell convincing himself that Patterson had been part of a larger conspiracy and that additional enemies would soon arrive to avenge their fallen comrade. He began preparing for what he believed would be an extended siege, reinforcing his cabin's defenses and rationing supplies for a prolonged battle against imaginary opponents. Russell's mental state continued deteriorating after the murder, with his journal entries becoming increasingly incoherent and filled with references to elaborate military campaigns against multiple enemy forces. He began experiencing auditory hallucinations that he interpreted as radio communications from hostile commanders coordinating attacks against his position. And he spent days constructing elaborate defensive positions around his cabin while preparing for battles that would never occur. The psychological isolation that had triggered his initial paranoid delusions was now compounded by the trauma and guilt of having committed murder, accelerating his complete break from reality. The discovery of Russell's crime came in early April, when Patterson's failure to return from his wilderness journey prompted a search and rescue operation that eventually led investigators to Russell's remote cabin. When search teams arrived, they found Russell barricaded inside his fortified shelter, convinced that the approaching rescuers were enemy forces attempting to capture or kill him. The confrontation that followed required trained negotiators and mental health professionals to convince Russell to surrender peacefully, as his paranoid delusions prevented him from recognizing that the people outside his cabin were there to help rather than harm him. The investigation that followed Russell's arrest revealed the complete scope of his psychological breakdown through the detailed journal he had maintained throughout the winter. Mental health evaluations confirmed that Russell had experienced a severe psychotic break triggered by prolonged isolation, social deprivation, and the unique stressors associated with surviving alone in Alaska's harsh winter environment. Expert testimony at his trial established that isolation-induced psychosis was a recognized psychological condition that could affect even mentally healthy individuals under extreme circumstances. Though Russell's case represented an unusually severe and violent manifestation of the syndrome, Patterson's murder became a landmark case in Alaska's legal system for establishing precedents about how isolation-induced mental illness should be considered in criminal proceedings. Russell's defense team argued that his psychological breakdown was so complete that he could not be held fully responsible for actions committed while experiencing severe psychotic delusions, while prosecutors maintained that premeditation evidence in his journal demonstrated retained capacity for criminal intent despite his mental deterioration. The case highlighted the complex relationship between extreme environmental conditions, mental health, and criminal responsibility in Alaska's unique geographical and social context. Russell was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, with provisions for ongoing mental health treatment and evaluation. His case became required study material for Alaska's law enforcement and mental health professionals as an example of how quickly isolation could transform stable individuals into dangerous threats to themselves and others. The psychological evaluation reports provided detailed documentation of how cabin fever and social isolation could progress from mild depression and anxiety to complete psychotic breaks involving paranoid delusions and homicidal behavior. The broader implications of Russell's case extended beyond individual criminal responsibility to raise questions about the adequacy of safety protocols for people choosing to spend extended periods alone in Alaska's remote wilderness areas. Mental health experts argued that Russell's breakdown could have been prevented through better preparation, regular contact requirements, and recognition of early warning signs that indicated developing psychological problems. His case led to recommendations that wilderness agencies and outfitters provide better education about isolation-induced mental health risks and establish more comprehensive check-in procedures for people spending extended periods alone in remote areas. Russell's story also highlighted the unique psychological challenges associated with Alaska's extreme winter conditions, where months of darkness, severe cold, and complete social isolation can create perfect conditions for mental health deterioration even among experienced outdoorsmen. The case demonstrated that wilderness survival skills, military training, and psychological stability during normal conditions provide no guarantee against cabin fever and isolation. Induced psychosis, when environmental stressors become extreme and prolonged. The cabin where Russell committed his crime was eventually burned down by authorities, both to eliminate evidence and to prevent the site from becoming a morbid attraction for thrill seekers or true crime enthusiasts. However, the location remains marked in Alaska's criminal history as an example of how the state's harsh environment can push human psychology beyond normal limits, creating conditions where rational people become capable of irrational and violent acts that would be inconceivable under normal circumstances. Patterson's death represents one of Alaska's most tragic examples of how isolation and environmental stress can interact with human psychology to produce devastating consequences. His murder by someone experiencing complete psychological breakdown serves as a warning about the mental health risks associated with extreme wilderness living, particularly during Alaska's brutal winter months, when normal social supports and reality checks are completely unavailable. Mental health professionals who studied Russell's case emphasize that cabin fever and isolation-induced psychosis are preventable conditions that develop predictably when social isolation is combined with environmental stress and inadequate mental health preparation. Russell's detailed journal provided unprecedented insight into how paranoid delusions develop and intensify over time, creating a psychological framework that can transform innocent visitors into perceived mortal enemies, requiring violent elimination. Today, Russell remains incarcerated and continues to receive treatment for the psychological conditions that led to his violent breakdown during that isolated winter near McGrath. His case continues to influence Alaska's approach to wilderness safety education, mental health preparation for extended isolation, and legal precedents for crimes committed during extreme psychological distress. The story serves as a sobering reminder that Alaska's wilderness challenges not just physical survival skills, but also psychological resilience, and that some people who successfully handle the physical demands of extreme isolation may still fall victim to mental breakdowns that transform them into dangers to themselves and anyone unlucky enough to encounter them. Patterson's senseless death and Russell's psychological destruction demonstrate how Alaska's harsh environment can push human beings beyond their breaking points in ways that destroy lives and families far beyond the immediate victims. In a state where isolation and self-reliance are often romanticized as expressions of human independence and strength, Russell's story provides a dark counterpoint showing how those same conditions can strip away the social and psychological supports that keep human behavior within civilized boundaries, creating monsters where there were once stable and responsible people. The legacy of the cabin fever killing near McGrath continues to influence discussions about wilderness safety, mental health preparation, and the hidden costs of extreme isolation in Alaska's remote areas. Russell's journal remains one of the most detailed and disturbing documents of psychological breakdown ever recovered from Alaska's wilderness, providing a chilling window into how quickly the human mind can deteriorate when pushed beyond its limits by isolation, paranoia, and the relentless psychological pressure of surviving alone in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Our 10th story brings us to the culmination of our journey through Alaska's darkest mysteries. The Alaska Triangle itself, a vast region where over 20,000 people have vanished without a trace since the 1970s, creating a pattern of disappearances so extensive and inexplicable that it challenges everything we thought we knew about missing person cases and the very nature of reality itself. This triangular region, bounded roughly by Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik, covers 200,000 square miles of some of the most remote and dangerous terrain on Earth. But the sheer volume and bizarre nature of disappearances here suggests something far more sinister than harsh weather or difficult terrain. The Alaska Triangle first gained national attention in October 1972, when a small aircraft carrying some of America's most powerful political figures simply vanished from radar without any distress signal or explanation. House Majority Leader Thomas Hale Boggs Sr., Alaska Congressman Nick Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns were flying from Anchorage to Juneau when their plane disappeared completely during what should have been a routine 2-hour flight. Despite launching one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history, involving over 50 civilian aircraft and 40 military craft scouring 32,000 square miles for more than a month, searchers never found a single piece of wreckage, personal belongings, or any trace that the aircraft had ever existed. What made the Boggs disappearance particularly intriguing was the political context surrounding the victims. Hale Boggs had been a member of the Warren Commission that investigated President Kennedy's assassination, and he had publicly expressed doubts about the commission's findings regarding Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. His disappearance in such a mysterious manner fueled conspiracy theories that suggested his elimination was politically motivated, though no evidence has ever emerged to support such claims. The complete absence of any physical evidence from the crash remains one of aviation's most baffling mysteries, particularly given the extensive resources devoted to the search operation. The pattern of unexplained disappearances in the Alaska Triangle extends far beyond high-profile political cases to include ordinary citizens, experienced outdoorsmen, and seasoned pilots who vanish under circumstances that defy logical explanation. Paul Lemaitre, a 65-year-old marathon runner, disappeared during his first marathon race while only 200 feet from the finish line, vanishing between giving his bib number to a race official and crossing the end marker. Despite the tiny search area and immediate response from state troopers, mountain rescue experts, and trained search dogs, no trace of Lemaitre was ever found, as if he had simply stepped out of existence in front of hundreds of witnesses. Alan Foster, an expert pilot with nearly 10,000 flight hours, provides another example of the triangle's inexplicable nature. In 2013, Foster's aircraft disappeared from radar shortly after takeoff, with his last communication indicating no distress or mechanical problems. The only unusual detail was his descent to 1,100 feet altitude just before losing contact. But neither Foster nor his aircraft were ever located despite extensive search efforts. The complete absence of wreckage in cases like Foster's defies aviation investigation protocols, as aircraft crashes typically leave debris fields that can be detected even in Alaska's vast wilderness. Richard Griffiths represents perhaps the most bizarre category of Alaska Triangle disappearances. People who vanish while specifically prepared for wilderness survival. Griffiths was an inventor who had developed a specialized wilderness survival cocoon and traveled to Alaska in 2006 to test his equipment's effectiveness. After taking a bus to the White River area and checking into a local lodge, Griffiths informed other guests of his plans to camp near McCarthy, a small town near St. Elias National Park. He then walked into the wilderness and was never seen again. despite being equipped with survival gear specifically designed for extended backcountry living. No trace of Griffith's or his survival cocoon has ever been discovered, suggesting that whatever force operates in the Alaska Triangle affects even those best prepared to handle its challenges. The statistical reality of disappearances in the Alaska Triangle is genuinely staggering and defies conventional explanation. Alaska records twice the national average of missing person cases, with approximately 2,250 people vanishing annually in the Triangle region alone. This represents an extraordinary rate of disappearance for a sparsely populated state, suggesting that geographical and environmental factors alone cannot account for the phenomenon. The Triangle's disappearance rate becomes even more disturbing when compared to Alaska's total population. Roughly 730,000 people live in the entire state. Yet the Triangle accounts for thousands of disappearances each year. Field researcher Ken Gerhard, who conducted extensive investigations in the Alaska Triangle, reported experiencing the phenomenon firsthand during his research expeditions. According to Gerhard, 2 separate individuals disappeared while he and his team were actively conducting field research in the area. One person vanished from a cruise ship, while another disappeared from a crowded tourist area on top of a mountain. These incidents demonstrate that the Triangle's effects are not limited to isolated wilderness locations, but can apparently operate even in populated areas with numerous witnesses present. The nature of disappearances in the Alaska Triangle often involves elements that challenge conventional understanding of how people become lost or killed in wilderness environments. Many cases involve experienced outdoorsmen, trained pilots, or individuals familiar with Alaska's conditions who vanish under circumstances where their expertise should have prevented problems. Gary Frank Southerden, a New York hunter who disappeared in the 1970s, represents one of the few Triangle cases where remains were eventually recovered. A human skull found along the Porcupine River in 1997 was identified through DNA analysis in 2022 as belonging to Southerden, with evidence suggesting he died from a bear attack. However, Southerden's case is notable precisely because it represents one of the rare instances where Triangle disappearances can be attributed to identifiable natural causes. The psychological impact of investigating Alaska Triangle disappearances extends beyond the immediate families and searchers to affect researchers and law enforcement personnel who encounter the phenomenon's inexplicable nature. Multiple investigators have reported feeling deeply unsettled by the complete absence of physical evidence in most Triangle cases, describing the experience as investigating crimes where all traces of the victims have been methodically erased from existence. This psychological effect contributes to the Triangle's reputation among Alaska's law enforcement community, where seasoned troopers acknowledge privately that certain cases simply cannot be solved using conventional investigative methods. Indigenous perspectives on the Alaska Triangle disappearances provide cultural context that suggests the phenomenon may have ancient origins predating modern settlement. Native Tlingit and Tsimshian peoples have traditional stories about a shape-shifting creature called the Kushtaka that lures humans into the wilderness by imitating other people's voices and appearances. These legends describe entities that can perfectly mimic human behavior while possessing supernatural abilities to make people disappear permanently. While skeptics dismiss such folklore as primitive superstition, the detailed traditional knowledge of disappearance patterns in specific geographical areas suggests that indigenous communities may have observed Triangle phenomena for centuries before modern documentation began. Environmental theories attempting to explain Alaska Triangle disappearances focus on the region's unique geographical and atmospheric conditions, though none adequately account for the scale and nature of the phenomenon. Some researchers suggest that unusual magnetic activity in the area could interfere with navigation equipment and human spatial orientation, potentially causing people to become lost in ways that prevent effective search and rescue operations. Others propose that the triangle's position relative to tectonic activity and electromagnetic field variations could create conditions that affect human consciousness or perception, though no scientific evidence supports such speculative mechanisms. The aviation aspects of Alaska Triangle disappearances present particularly troubling evidence. The conventional explanations are inadequate. Alaska's aviation community reports numerous incidents of aircraft experiencing unexplained equipment failures, navigation anomalies, and communication disruptions while flying through Triangle airspace, even during favorable weather conditions. These reports describe aircraft instruments malfunctioning simultaneously, compass readings becoming unreliable, and radio communications being disrupted by interference that doesn't correspond to known atmospheric or electromagnetic phenomena. While individual equipment failures are common in aviation, the clustering of such incidents in Triangle airspace suggests systematic rather than random causation. The Alaska Triangle's reputation has attracted paranormal investigators and conspiracy theorists who propose explanations ranging from extraterrestrial activity to interdimensional portals, though such theories lack empirical support. UFO sightings are reported more frequently in Alaska than in most other states, leading some researchers to suggest connections between aerial phenomena and disappearance patterns. However, the scientific community generally dismisses such explanations as attempts to impose supernatural causation on statistical clusters that can be explained through conventional factors like harsh environmental conditions, vast search areas, and inadequate resources for comprehensive investigation. More disturbing than any single theory about Triangle disappearances is the pattern of official responses that suggests governmental awareness of phenomena beyond conventional explanation. Federal agencies, including the FBI, National Transportation Safety Board, and military investigation units have devoted extensive resources to Triangle cases, often classifying their findings in ways that prevent public disclosure. The classification of investigation results implies that official agencies have discovered evidence too sensitive for public release, whether due to national security implications or findings that would challenge public understanding of disappearance phenomena. The cumulative psychological impact of Alaska Triangle cases on search and rescue personnel has led to informal protocols among Alaska's emergency responders that acknowledge the unique challenges of Triangle operations. Veteran searchers report that Triangle cases often involve elements that violate normal search procedures. Tracks that end abruptly in areas where continuation should be possible. Personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. And search areas where electronic equipment consistently malfunctions despite proper maintenance and testing. Modern technology has failed to provide solutions to Alaska Triangle mysteries despite advances in satellite surveillance, GPS tracking, and communication systems that should make disappearances less likely and easier to investigate. The continued high rate of Triangle disappearances during the digital age suggests that whatever causes the phenomenon is not affected by technological improvements in navigation, communication, or emergency response capabilities. This technological ineffectiveness implies that Triangle disappearances involve factors that operate beyond the reach of conventional detection and prevention methods. The Alaska Triangle's influence on popular culture and tourism presents an interesting paradox where the region's dangerous reputation actually attracts visitors seeking to experience paranormal phenomena or to test themselves against its mysterious challenges. This tourism creates additional opportunities for disappearances while generating economic benefits for local communities that depend on visitor spending. The ethical implications of promoting tourism to an area with documented high disappearance rates illustrate the complex relationship between economic necessity and public safety in Alaska's remote regions. Long-term demographic studies of Alaska Triangle disappearances reveal patterns that challenge conventional assumptions about victim selection and survival factors. Disappearances affect all age groups, experience levels, and equipment capabilities without apparent correlation to traditional risk factors that predict wilderness survival outcomes. Children and elderly individuals disappear at rates similar to experienced outdoorsmen and trained military personnel, suggesting that whatever causes triangle phenomena operates independently of human preparedness or capability factors. The international implications of Alaska Triangle phenomena extend beyond American borders, as similar disappearance patterns have been reported in other high-latitude regions, with comparable geographical and atmospheric conditions. Research into global disappearance clusters suggests that the Alaska Triangle may represent a local manifestation of worldwide phenomena that affect specific geographical areas characterized by unique combinations of electromagnetic, atmospheric, and geological factors. This global perspective implies that triangle disappearances might be predictable and potentially preventable if underlying causation mechanisms could be identified and understood. Family members of Alaska Triangle victims have formed informal support networks that provide emotional assistance while advocating for continued investigation into their loved ones' disappearances. These families report feeling frustrated by official agencies' inability to provide satisfactory explanations or closure, leading to private investigations and alternative theories about triangle phenomena. The persistent advocacy of victim families has kept triangle cases in public awareness and pressured authorities to maintain active investigation files despite the passage of years or decades without resolution. The Alaska Triangle stands as America's most mysterious and dangerous geographical anomaly. A region where the normal rules of survival, search and rescue, and criminal investigation seem suspended by forces that operate beyond current scientific understanding. Whether the triangle's disappearances result from unique environmental conditions, unknown natural phenomena, or something far more disturbing than conventional explanation can encompass, the documented evidence proves that certain areas of Alaska pose risks that transcend normal wilderness dangers. For over 20,000 people who have entered the Alaska Triangle never to return, the region represents a doorway to oblivion that continues claiming victims despite decades of investigation, advanced technology, and extensive public awareness of its dangers. The Alaska Triangle reminds us that even in our modern age of satellite surveillance and instant communication, vast areas of our planet remain mysterious and potentially deadly in ways that challenge human understanding. In Alaska's Triangle, the wilderness doesn't just hide its secrets. It makes them disappear entirely, along with anyone unlucky enough to uncover them. Those who venture into the Triangle do so knowing they may join the thousands who have already vanished without trace, becoming part of America's most extensive and inexplicable missing person phenomenon. The Triangle waits patiently for its next victims, a hungry void in the heart of Alaska that continues to expand its collection of the missing with each passing year. Our final story brings us to the darkest corner of Alaska's technological frontier, where modern communication systems become conduits for something ancient and malevolent. In March 2011, a remote telecommunications tower near Deadhorse began transmitting signals that should have been impossible, carrying messages from people who had been dead for decades and broadcasting the final moments of victims whose disappearances had never been solved. What started as routine maintenance work on Alaska's most isolated communication infrastructure would evolve into one of the state's most disturbing encounters with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of life and death. Marcus Webb had worked as a telecommunications technician for over 15 years, specializing in the remote systems that kept Alaska's scattered communities connected to the outside world. His expertise with satellite relays, microwave towers, and emergency broadcasting equipment made him one of the few technicians qualified to service the isolated facilities that dotted Alaska's vast wilderness. providing crucial communication links for oilfield operations, weather monitoring, and emergency services. Marcus understood that these remote installations were lifelines for people working in some of Earth's most dangerous and isolated locations, making his maintenance work literally a matter of life and death for the workers who depended on reliable communications. The Dead Horse facility that would change Marcus's life forever was located nearly 200 miles north of Fairbanks, accessible only by ice road during winter months and completely cut off from ground transportation during summer thaw. The installation consisted of a 300-foot tower equipped with multiple satellite dishes, microwave relays, and emergency broadcasting equipment designed to maintain communication links even during extreme weather events. The facility was completely automated, monitored remotely from Anchorage, and visited by technicians only when equipment failures required hands-on repairs that couldn't be completed using remote diagnostics. Marcus's March 2011 service call was prompted by reports of unusual signal interference that was disrupting communications throughout northern Alaska's oilfield operations. Workers at remote drilling sites reported hearing strange voices during radio transmissions, receiving emergency calls from people who weren't at their reported locations, and experiencing equipment malfunctions that seemed to affect multiple communication channels simultaneously. The problems had been escalating for several weeks, prompting Marcus's employer to dispatch him for comprehensive equipment testing and repairs. The helicopter flight to the Dead Horse facility took Marcus over hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, providing spectacular views of Alaska's winter landscape, but also emphasizing the complete isolation of his destination. The pilot who transported Marcus was an experienced Arctic flyer, who mentioned during the flight that other pilots had been reporting unusual radio chatter in the area, voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize, emergency transmissions from aircraft that weren't showing on radar, and interference patterns that seemed to move across different frequencies in organized ways rather than random static. When Marcus arrived at the facility, his initial equipment diagnostics revealed problems that defied his 15 years of technical experience. The tower's primary transmitters were operating normally according to their internal monitoring systems, but the signals they were broadcasting contained embedded audio that wasn't being generated by any of the facility's equipment. Digital analysis revealed that the tower was somehow amplifying and retransmitting signals from unknown sources, creating a complex mixture of legitimate communications and mysterious broadcasts that appeared to originate from locations that shouldn't have been capable of generating radio transmissions. The first indication that Marcus was dealing with something beyond technical malfunction came when he began recording and analyzing the anomalous signals using his spectrum analyzer and digital audio equipment. Among the interference patterns, he discovered clear voice transmissions that included names, dates, and location references that matched missing persons cases from throughout Alaska's history. Most disturbing of all, some of the voices were speaking in the first person, describing experiences of being lost, injured, or pursued by unknown entities in remote wilderness locations. Marcus's technical training led him to assume that the mysterious broadcasts were somehow picking up and retransmitting old emergency communications that had been stored in the facility's digital memory systems or reflected off atmospheric layers during unusual weather conditions. However, as he continued analyzing the signals throughout his first day at the facility, he realized that the broadcasts contained information that couldn't have been stored in any existing communication system. Detailed descriptions of locations, events, and experiences that had never been documented in official records or emergency transmissions. One of the most disturbing broadcasts Marcus recorded was a detailed distress call from a bush pilot describing mechanical failure and forced landing in a remote valley, providing precise geographical coordinates and aircraft identification numbers that matched a 1987 disappearance case that had never been solved. The pilot's voice described his situation in real time, reporting his attempts to repair his aircraft and survive in the wilderness while waiting for rescue that never arrived. Most chilling of all, the transmission included weather conditions and seasonal details that matched historical records from the time of the disappearance, as if the pilot's final days were somehow being broadcast decades after his death. Autumn as night fell on Marcus's first day at the facility. The anomalous transmissions increased in frequency and intensity, creating a constant stream of voices that seemed to be calling out from Alaska's vast wilderness. Marcus recognized some of the voices from missing persons cases that had received media attention: hikers, hunters, and travelers who had vanished without trace in remote areas throughout the state. Their broadcasts described their final experiences in heartbreaking detail, providing information about their last known locations and the circumstances that led to their deaths or disappearances. The psychological impact of listening to these broadcasts was profound and immediate, as Marcus realized he was somehow receiving the final communications from people who had died alone in Alaska's wilderness, their voices preserved and transmitted by forces that operated beyond conventional understanding of radio technology and physics. The voices weren't just playing back recorded messages. They were interactive, responding to Marcus's presence at the facility and directly addressing him by name, despite the fact that they should have had no knowledge of his identity or location. Marcus's sleep was constantly interrupted by transmissions that seemed specifically designed to attract his attention, featuring voices that called his name and provided detailed descriptions of his appearance, equipment, and activities at the facility. The broadcasts began incorporating personal information about Marcus's life, family, and work history that couldn't have been obtained through normal means, suggesting that whatever intelligence was generating the transmissions had access to information sources that transcended normal communication channels. By his second day at the facility, Marcus had documented over 30 distinct voices broadcasting from different time periods, locations, and circumstances throughout Alaska's history. The broadcasts included victims of aircraft crashes, wilderness accidents, criminal violence, and unexplained disappearances, all apparently transmitting their final experiences through the facility's equipment. Most disturbing of all, several of the voices claimed to be aware of each other and were apparently communicating among themselves, creating conversations between people who had died decades apart in completely different locations. The facility's equipment began exhibiting increasingly bizarre behavior that suggested the anomalous transmissions were somehow affecting its normal operations. Satellite dishes rotated to track signals from locations that contained no broadcasting equipment. Emergency alert systems activated randomly to broadcast the mysterious voices across Alaska's communication networks, and power consumption spiked dramatically, as if the facility was amplifying signals that required enormous amounts of energy to transmit. Marcus realized that the facility had somehow become a conduit for communications from beyond normal reality, transforming routine telecommunication equipment into a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The most terrifying aspect of Marcus's experience was the gradual realization that the voices were not just broadcasting from the past, but were actively trying to communicate with him in real time. They provided warnings about dangers at the facility, offered advice about equipment repairs, and described environmental conditions that Marcus could verify through direct observation. The voices seemed to possess current knowledge about his situation and were attempting to establish genuine communication rather than simply replaying recorded messages from their final moments. Marcus's attempts to communicate directly with the voices produced responses that confirmed his worst fears about the nature of the phenomenon. When he spoke into his radio equipment, the voices responded immediately, addressing his questions and providing detailed answers about their deaths, their current existence, and the mechanism that allowed them to broadcast through the facility's equipment. They described being trapped in a state between life and death, unable to move on from their final moments but capable of observing and communicating with the living under specific technological conditions. The voices explained that the facility had somehow become aligned with what they termed death frequencies, specific electromagnetic wavelengths that existed at the boundary between physical reality and whatever realm contained consciousness after death. They claimed that Alaska's unique geographical and atmospheric conditions created natural resonance points where such communication became possible, and that the facility's powerful transmitters had accidentally tuned into these frequencies during recent atmospheric disturbances caused by solar activity and magnetic field fluctuations. As Marcus prepared to complete his repairs and evacuate the facility, the broadcasts became increasingly urgent and desperate, with multiple voices pleading with him not to leave and begging him to find ways to maintain the communication links they had established. They described their existence as a form of psychological limbo, where they remained conscious of their deaths while being unable to escape the final moments of their lives, doomed to endlessly repeat their last experiences unless they could somehow establish contact with the living world. The voices warned Marcus that shutting down the facility's equipment would sever their only connection to the world of the living, condemning them to eternal isolation in whatever realm they currently inhabited. They offered to provide him with information about unsolved disappearances, hidden treasure locations, and other valuable knowledge in exchange for maintaining the communication system that allowed them to interact with living people. The ethical implications of this bargain tormented Marcus as he realized that he held the power to either grant peace to tortured souls or condemn them to continued suffering. Marcus's final decision was influenced by a broadcast from his own father, who had died in an aircraft crash in remote Alaska when Marcus was 12 years old. His father's voice came through the facility's speakers with perfect clarity, providing details about his final flight that had never been discovered by search and rescue teams. Marcus's father explained that he had been trying to communicate with his son for years, but had been unable to establish contact until the facility created the proper conditions for trans-dimensional communication. The emotional impact of hearing his father's voice after nearly 30 years was overwhelming, and convinced Marcus that the phenomenon was genuine rather than some elaborate hoax or hallucination. However, Marcus's father warned him that maintaining the communication link would come at a terrible personal cost, as prolonged exposure to death frequencies would gradually erode the barrier between life and death in Marcus's own consciousness. He explained that the facility's workers who had previously been exposed to the anomalous signals had experienced progressive psychological deterioration that eventually led to their own deaths, as their minds became unable to distinguish between the realm of the living and the domain of the dead. Despite his father's warnings and the obvious dangers involved, Marcus made the decision to document the phenomenon and preserve the communication link by modifying the facility's equipment to continue broadcasting the anomalous signals. He installed additional recording equipment to capture the voice's communications and established protocols that would allow the broadcasts to continue automatically even after he left the facility. Marcus believed that the voice's knowledge about unsolved disappearances and hidden locations could provide closure for families and valuable information for law enforcement agencies, justifying the risks involved in maintaining contact with the realm of the dead. Marcus's evacuation from the facility was delayed by severe weather that trapped him at the site for an additional week, during which his prolonged exposure to the death frequencies began producing the psychological effects his father had warned him about. Marcus started experiencing vivid hallucinations where he could see the deceased individuals whose voices he had been hearing, and he began losing the ability to distinguish between his memories of the living world and the experiences the voices described from their deaths. His final journal entries from the facility document growing confusion about his own identity and increasing difficulty maintaining connection to normal reality. The helicopter crew that eventually evacuated Marcus reported that he seemed disoriented and claimed to be receiving radio communications from his dead father, even when no radio equipment was operating. Medical evaluation after his rescue revealed no physical injuries or exposure-related health problems. But psychological assessment indicated severe dissociative symptoms and what appeared to be post-traumatic stress disorder related to his experience at the facility. Marcus required extensive therapy to recover his sense of reality and distinguish between his own memories and the experiences he had absorbed from the voices of the dead. The Dead Horse facility continued operating automatically after Marcus's evacuation, broadcasting the anomalous signals throughout Alaska's communication networks and affecting radio equipment across the northern part of the state. Multiple reports were filed about mysterious voice transmissions, equipment malfunctions, and electromagnetic interference that seemed to center on the facility's location. However, when technical crews were dispatched to investigate and repair the problems, they found that the facility's equipment was operating normally and showed no signs of the modifications Marcus claimed to have installed. Official investigation into Marcus's reports was conducted by multiple agencies, including the Federal Communications Commission, military communication specialists, and scientific researchers interested in anomalous electromagnetic phenomena. However, their analysis of the facility's equipment and recorded transmissions found no evidence of the death frequency broadcasts Marcus had documented. The facility's digital recording systems contained only normal communication traffic and atmospheric interference, with no traces of the mysterious voices that had tormented Marcus during his week at the isolated site. Marcus spent the remainder of his career advocating for recognition of the phenomenon he had experienced, arguing that Alaska's communication infrastructure had become contaminated by signals from deceased individuals who remained conscious after death. He established contact with families of missing persons whose voices he claimed to have heard, providing them with detailed information about their loved ones' final experiences that couldn't have been obtained through normal investigation methods. While some families found comfort in Marcus's accounts, others considered his claims to be cruel exploitation of their grief and loss. The controversy surrounding Marcus's experience led to changes in maintenance procedures for Alaska's remote communication facilities, with new requirements for multiple technicians to work together at isolated sites and mandatory psychological evaluation following extended exposure to high-powered transmission equipment. These protocols were implemented partly to prevent similar incidents and partly to ensure that maintenance workers weren't adversely affected by the isolation and electromagnetic exposure associated with remote facility servicing. Marcus never fully recovered from his experience at the Dead Horse facility and died by suicide in 2018, leaving behind detailed journals and recordings that documented his ongoing communication with voices of the dead. His final notes claimed that the death frequencies had permanently altered his consciousness, making it impossible for him to fully exist in the world of the living, while being unable to join the deceased individuals who continued speaking to him through electronic equipment. Marcus's tragic end serves as a warning about the psychological dangers associated with investigating phenomena that exist beyond human understanding. The Dead Horse facility remains operational and continues to provide communication services for Alaska's northern oil fields. But it has developed a reputation among telecommunications workers as a location where equipment behaves unpredictably and personnel experience unusual psychological effects. Several technicians have reported hearing voices during routine maintenance work, though none have experienced the level of contact Marcus claimed to have achieved with the realm of the dead. Today, Marcus's story is discussed among Alaska's communication workers as either a cautionary tale about isolation-induced psychosis or evidence that the state's remote technology infrastructure has become a bridge between the world of the living and whatever realm contains human consciousness after death. Whether Marcus genuinely contacted the voices of Alaska's missing and deceased individuals or suffered a complete psychological breakdown triggered by isolation and electromagnetic exposure remains one of the state's most controversial, unsolved mysteries. The implications of Marcus's experience extend beyond personal tragedy to raise fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and the possibility that human awareness can persist after physical death under specific technological conditions. His detailed documentation of the voice's communications provides either compelling evidence for life after death, or a devastating example of how isolation and stress can create elaborate hallucinations that feel completely real to those experiencing them. Marcus's legacy continues through the families he contacted, with information about missing loved ones and the ongoing investigation into anomalous electromagnetic phenomena in Alaska's communication infrastructure. Whether his final broadcasts from the Dead Horse facility represented genuine contact with the dead, or the last desperate communications of a man losing his grip on reality, his story stands as a reminder that Alaska's wilderness holds mysteries that may be too dangerous for human minds to fully comprehend. If you've made it this far through our journey into Alaska's darkest secrets, you've experienced just a fraction of the terror that lurks in America's last frontier. These 11 stories represent only the beginning of the horrors that Alaska's wilderness has to offer. There are hundreds more documented cases of disappearances, supernatural encounters, and unsolved mysteries waiting to be told. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because Verified Fears is going to continue exploring Alaska's most disturbing true stories. Drop a comment below telling us which story affected you the most, and let us know what other dark mysteries you want us to investigate. Share this video with anyone brave enough to handle the truth about what really happens in Alaska's remote wilderness. But be warned, once you start learning about these cases, you'll never look at Alaska the same way again. And remember, every story we've told you tonight is based on documented evidence, official reports, and eyewitness testimony. These aren't legends or folklore. They're the real experiences of people who ventured into Alaska's wilderness and encountered something that changed them forever. Some made it back to tell their stories. Others became part of the mystery themselves.